Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. The morning sun is just beginning to crest the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over Carrigini National Park. I feel a mix of excitement and apprehension as I load my Land Cruiser for my first solo patrol. I check my gear one last time. Radio check. Map check. Water and supplies. All accounted for. I climb into the driver's seat and start the engine, the sound breaking the morning stillness. This park, with its rugged terrain and untamed beauty, is now my responsibility. The Australian outback stretches out before me, vast and unyielding. I can't help but think about how far I've come to be here. With a sense of nostalgia, I reach into the glove compartment and pull out a weathered, leather-bound notebook. Flipping it open, I'm greeted by a collage of notes, sketches, and photographs. More than half of the photos feature me and my father in various outdoor settings, snapshots of our shared adventures. My parents divorced when I was just a kid, so my life was split between their two worlds. Growing up, I spent the weekdays with my mum in the stifling urban sprawl of Perth, but the weekends were my escape. My dad would come whisk me away to a different reality. We'd go exploring the national parks all across Western Australia, hiking through dense bushland and camping under starlit skies. The trips were a much-needed escape from the confines of city life and the constant tension between me and Mum's new boyfriend, Mark, a prick who could never seem to hide his disdain for me. The feeling was mutual. As I flip through the images, I see myself growing up, from a curious child in awe of the natural world to a teenager, more confident and assured, always by my dad's side. One particular photo catches my eye. It's of me, at about 9 or 10 years old, around the time of the divorce. I'm standing with Dad by a serene lake, our smiles as wide as the horizon behind us. We're proudly holding up a fish we caught together. I gently turn the photo over. There, in my dad's familiar, slanted handwriting, is a message that strikes a chord in my heart. The wilderness is where you'll find yourself. The last photo in the collection, taken on the weekend of my 15th birthday, is one I rarely look at, but today, I feel compelled to. We're sitting on a rocky outcrop, our faces turned towards the setting sun. Dad's arm is around my shoulders, and I'm leaning into him, a half smile on my face. But it's his expression that catches my eye. There's a shadow that hangs over him. He was a man haunted by demons that he never spoke with me about, and that I was always too afraid to ever ask. Despite the darkness that seemed to cling to him, my love for him was unwavering. His complexities, in a way, made me love him more. He was my rock, my constant in a sea of change. In my heart of hearts, I had convinced myself that it would always be the two of us, father and daughter, side by side, against the world. The crackle of the radio startles me out of my reverie. The voice of my supervisor's familiar, gruff voice fills the cabin. "Harnum, do you read me?" I pick up the radio and press the button, my voice steady, but with an undercurrent of anticipation. "This is Ranger Arnhem, reading you loud and clear. What's the good word, Big Mike? Just checking in to see if you're all set for your solo excursion," Big Mike replies. "Yeah, all good here." Just about to head out, I smile, appreciating his concern. "Remember, kiddo, this park's a wild place. Keep your wits about you and don't take unnecessary risks," he advises. "Absolutely. I promise I won't do anything you wouldn't," I reply with a playful tone that elicits a chuckle on the other end. "Good, that's what I like to hear. And hey, Willow," he adds, a hint of warmth breaking through his usually stoic demeanor, "your old man would be proud of you. You've got this." A lump forms in my throat at his words. In a lot of ways, becoming a park ranger was my attempt to stay connected with Dad in the only way I knew how. "Thanks, b.m. I'll report back by late afternoon. Arnhem out, I say, signing off. As I navigate the rug tracks winding through the park, the sun climbs higher, casting sharp shadows across the red earth. The landscape is breathtaking, with gorges slicing through the terrain and ancient rock formations, standing as silent witnesses to time. Several uneventful hours into my patrol, the landscape unfolds in a familiar rhythm: red earth, towering gorges, and the occasional wildlife. It's a typical day in Karijini, tranquil yet alive with the whispers of nature. However, as I approach the remote area near Wino Gorge, something catches my eye. It's a subtle disturbance, a flicker of movement, or a shade out of place, hard to discern at first, but unmistakably unusual. Wino Gorge, while known for its breathtaking views, is rarely visited, its beauty guarded by the ruggedness of its terrain. It could be anything: a lost hiker, a rare animal sighting, or perhaps just a trick of light and shadow. But as a park ranger in this unforgiving expanse, every possibility warrants attention. Curiosity piqued, I decide to take a detour to investigate. The stillness is shattered by the ominous rumble of shifting earth. My eyes dart upwards, catching sight of a massive boulder breaking free from the cliff above. Time seems to slow as I watch it tumble, gaining momentum, its path unmistakably aimed at my land cruiser. My heart pounds in my chest, a primal instinct to survive kicking in. Gripping the steering wheel, I swerve the vehicle with all the might I can muster. The landscape blurs as I make a desperate attempt to evade the impending collision. But the boulder, like a relentless predator, seems to follow my every move. The distance between us rapidly closes. With a final, futile twist of the wheel, I brace for impact. The world erupts into chaos. The deafening crash of metal against stone reverberates through the air. The 4x4 lurches violently, throwing me against my seatbelt as the world outside spins in a dizzying whirl of red dust and shattered glass. The airbags deploy with a force that feels like a punch to my chest and face, their rapid inflation cushioning the brutal impact. For a moment, everything is white and suffocating, the smell of propellant strong in my nostrils. My ears ring from the loud pop of the airbags and the thunderous crash of the boulder. Pain sears through my body as the vehicle comes to a jarring halt, tossed aside like a toy in the wake of the boulder's destructive path. I struggle to catch my breath, the air thick with dust and the acrid scent of burning rubber. I groan, a deep, seated pain throbbing in my head. My hand instinctively goes to my forehead, feeling the wetness of blood seeping through my fingers. Bloody hell, I mutter under my breath, the words barely audible over the ringing in my ears. I try to orient myself amidst the wreckage. The vehicle is crumpled, its frame twisted in an unnatural contortion. My head throbs, and my vision swims, but the urgency of the situation propels me forward. I quickly check myself for injuries. Apart from a throbbing pain in my head and a few bruises, I seem okay. The car, however, is another story. It's totaled. A twisted mass of metal and shattered glass, with smoke billowing from the hood. I fumble for the radio, my hands shaking. Base, this is Ranger Arnhem. I croak, hoping the radio survived the crash. Static crackles in response, a sign that communication might still be possible. I've been in an accident near Wino Gorge. Need immediate assistance. The radio remains silent, leaving me with a sinking feeling of isolation. Panic rises in my chest. I'm tens of kilometers away from the nearest ranger station, in a rarely patrolled part of the park. My water supply is limited, and with the harsh sun climbing higher, the heat becomes suffocating. The old fear, that gnawing sense of abandonment, starts creeping back, threatening to paralyze me. It's a ghost I thought I'd left behind, but here, in the vastness of the outback, it looms large once more. But I fight against the rising tide of panic. I close my eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on what I can control. You can do this, Willow, I say to myself through clenched teeth. I recall the survival training I underwent as part of my ranger induction. The countless hours of first aid, navigation, and emergency response drills. With a grimace, I try to push the car door open. It creaks and resists, a reminder of the force of the crash. As I exert more pressure, a sharp pain shoots through my arm, causing me to wince. Carefully, I assess my wrist. It's swollen and tender. I suspect it's sprained, maybe even fractured. I awkwardly maneuver out of the driver's seat, grabbing the first aid kit as I do so. Sitting on the ground, I lean against the vehicle, trying to steady my breathing. I give myself a more thorough examination, checking for other injuries I might have missed in the initial shock. The throbbing in my head is intense, and I feel a warm trickle of blood down my temple, maybe a concussion. There's a deep cut on my leg from the collision. It's bleeding, but not profusely. I clean the wounds as best as I can with the limited supplies in the kit and bandage them tightly. The pain in my wrist is persistent, but I manage to wrap it in a makeshift splint. As I sit there, gathering my thoughts, I remember passing a waterfall about 1 kilometer away on my patrol route. The thought of its shade and fresh water gives me a sliver of hope in this dire situation. I know I need to get there if I want to increase my chances of survival. Gathering my wits, I turn my attention to the GPS mounted on the dashboard, hoping for a glimmer of guidance. But my heart sinks as I find it damaged beyond use, its screen a spider web of cracks, lifeless and unresponsive. I turn to the glove compartment, rummaging through its contents until my fingers find the familiar, slightly worn edges of a map. Laying it flat on the hood of the damaged vehicle, I try to pinpoint my current location. Using landmarks I remember passing, like the distinctive shape of a nearby gorge and the direction I was heading, I estimate my position. It's not exact, but it should be close enough. I trace the contours and landmarks with my finger. The waterfall is marked clearly, a blue squiggle amidst a sea of browns and greens. I plot my course, mentally calculating the distance and the direction I need to head. The sun, now a fairy orb in the sky, will be my guide. I need to head east, towards the rising sun, then veer slightly north. Gathering my strength, I stand up, wincing at the sharp pain in my leg and wrist. I grab my backpack and fill it with supplies from the car, water canteens, emergency rations, a small survival kit, and most importantly my notebook. It's not much, but it's something. I put on a pair of sunglasses and a hat to shield myself from the relentless sun. I scour the area around the wreck, searching for anything that could serve as a makeshift walking stick. After a few minutes of searching, I find a sturdy, fallen branch. It's not perfect, but it's solid enough to support my weight and help me maintain my balance. The trek is grueling, each step a test of endurance. My sprained wrist throbs with every movement, and the cut on my leg stings sharply, but I push through the pain. The rugged terrain is unforgiving, with rocky outcrops and uneven ground making the journey more challenging. As I walk, I can't help but think of my dad. The stories he told me of his adventures in the wild, the tips he gave me for surviving in harsh conditions, they all come flooding back. I realize now how much those weekend excursions with him were not just about bonding, but also about preparing me for moments like this. Every few hundred meters, I come to a stop, taking sips from my canteen, rationing the precious water to make it last as long as possible. The sun relentlessly beat down on me, causing sweat to pour from my brow and evaporate instantly in the arid air. Each pause is also an opportunity to check the compass from my survival kit to ensure that I'm still heading in the right direction. As I trudge on, a nagging sensation begins to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness. It's a feeling of being watched, a prickling at the back of my neck that I can't quite shake off. At first, I dismiss it as the jitters, but the feeling persists. I catch fleeting glimpses of shadows moving at the edge of my vision, too quick to be just tricks of light. Every rustle of the underbrush, every snap of a twig sends a shiver down my spine. It's as if the landscape itself is watching me, a silent stalker just out of sight. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, I reach the waterfall. The sound of cascading water is a welcome relief, The shade provided by the surrounding trees offers a respite from the searing sun. I collapse near the water's edge. I crawl towards the water. The sound of it a soothing balm to my frazzled nerves. I carefully unscrew the cap of my canteen and dip it into the clear, cool water, filling it to the brim. The water is pristine, a lifeline in the unforgiving environment. I take a cautious sip, letting the liquid refresh my parched throat. The heat is relentless, and my body aches for relief. With a deep breath, I begin to strip off my dusty, sweat-soaked clothes. Each movement is a challenge with my injuries, but the thought of the cool water on my skin spurs me on. I leave my clothes in a neat pile on the rocks and step gingerly into the water. The shock of the coolness is immediate, sending shivers through my overheated body. I wade deeper, submerging myself up to my shoulders. The water soothes my aching muscles and the sting of my injuries. I immerse my head, letting the water flow over me, washing away the dust and fear that clung to me since the crash. As I float in the water, I allow myself a moment of vulnerability, letting the tears flow. They're tears of pain, frustration, but also of determination. But there's no time to linger in these emotions. I have to be practical, to think about survival. I emerge from the water and dress. I redo my bandaging, making sure they're secure. While I sit there, drying off in the sun, I start to formulate a plan. I know they'll send out a search party once I don't report back, but with the vastness of the park, it could be a while before they find me. I need to make myself as visible as possible. As the sun begins its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I find a suitable spot near the waterfall to set up a temporary camp. I clear the ground of debris and lay down a layer of leaves and branches to sit on. Gathering stones, I create a small circle for a fire, ensuring it's far enough from the trees and brush to prevent any risk of a wildfire. The process of starting a fire is arduous, especially with my injured wrist, but I persevere. Using a flint from my survival kit, I finally manage to spark a flame. I feed the fire with small twigs and branches, watching as the flames grow stronger. As the temperature drops rapidly, I wrap myself in a thermal blanket, huddling close to the fire's comforting glow. Underneath the star-studded sky, I can't help but feel a sense of vulnerability. The vastness of the wilderness and the isolation it brings are both inspiring and terrifying. Yet, the fire serves as a beacon of hope, a signal to any rescue aircraft that may be scouring the park for me. As night falls, the sounds of the outback become more pronounced. The distant calls of nocturnal animals, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the continuous murmur of the waterfall create a symphony of wilderness. I take out my notebook and a pen from my backpack and start to write. I jot down my location, the details of the accident, and my current situation. I note the direction I walked from the crash site and any landmarks I passed and cross-reference them on my map. After a while, I set aside the notebook and focus on staying warm and alert. I periodically add wood to the fire, ensuring it keeps burning throughout the night. I wrap myself in my thoughts, the crackling of the fire a soothing backdrop, when suddenly a rustling sound cuts through the silence. It's coming from the dense brush, just beyond the firelight's reach. I tense up, every muscle in my body on high alert. You've no doubt seen all those memes about how Australian wildlife is out to murder you. While mostly gross exaggerations, there's always a kernel of truth in them. The outback is home to some of the most unique, and yes, potentially dangerous creatures in the world. My mind races through the possibilities. Could it be a snake, a dingo, perhaps, or something larger? The rustling grows louder, more insistent. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerges. For a moment, my heart leaps into my throat. But it's not a predator. It's a joey, a young kangaroo. A male by the looks of it. His eyes wide with curiosity as he cautiously approaches the firelight. He's far too small to have caused the earlier disturbance in the brush. "He there, mate," I murmur, trying to keep my voice steady despite the unease churning in my gut. "You're all right. I'm not going to hurt you. Where's your mum? The kangaroo cocks his head slightly, as if considering my words, then takes a tentative step closer. In that moment, there's a sense of connection, a fleeting bond formed in the wilderness. But the serenity shatters in an instant. The ground beneath me starts trembling, sending ripples through the water, a subtle vibration at first that quickly escalates into a violent shudder. The joey, sensing the danger before I fully grasp it, bolts into the darkness, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly away. For a moment, I'm frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of the sudden shift in the peaceful night. Wait. I call out instinctively, though I know the kangaroo is far beyond hearing me. Pushing aside my blanket, I scramble to my feet, my pain momentarily forgotten in the adrenaline rush. I grab my flashlight and stumble forward, trying to follow the kangaroo, driven by an inexplicable urge to not be alone in this unsettling moment. Suddenly, the earth in front of me ruptures with a violence that knocks me off my feet. I scramble backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. From the fissure in the ground, a nightmarish creature emerges, its form so bizarre and terrifying that my mind struggles to comprehend it. The skin is a grotesque tapestry of oozing, putrid green-brown, and gray, resembling a patchwork of rot and decay. Slimy tendrils hang from its grotesque, bloated body, swaying with a perverse rhythm. The eyes, glowing a malevolent red, are sunken into its face, framed by sickly, translucent membranes that blink horizontally like the slit pupils of a snake. Frozen in terror, I can only stare as the creature opens its gaping maw, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. A low, guttural growl emanates from its throat, vibrating through the air and draining the blood from my face. Instinct kicks in, and I know I have to move. I stumble backwards, my injured leg protesting with sharp jabs of pain. The creature lunges forward, its movement surprisingly swift for its size. I dodge to the side, barely avoiding its snapping jaws. I scramble back to the fire, my breath ragged with fear and exertion. The creature is relentless, its every movement filled with predatory purpose. In a desperate bid for defense, I grab a flaming branch from the fire, the embers scattering in a shower of sparks. With every ounce of strength I have, I swing the branch at the monster. The flames lick at its grotesque skin, and it recoils with a hideous screech that pierces the night air. The smell of burning flesh and singed hair fills my nostrils, a nauseating reminder of the surreal danger I'm facing. I don't stop to think. I swing the branch again and again, each strike a desperate plea for survival. The monster, though visibly pained by the flames, is undeterred. It snarls and lunges at me with renewed ferocity, its claws swiping through the air, inches from my face. I retreat, circling the fire, using it as a barrier between myself and this nightmarish foe. I grab my bag, pivot on my heel, and sprint towards the waterfall, the only refuge I can think of. The creature follows, its guttural roars echoing off the rocky walls. My heart pounds in my ears, drowning out all other sounds except the monster's relentless pursuit. I don't dare look back, focusing only on the path ahead. Reaching the waterfall, I scan the area frantically for any crevice or overhang to hide in. The mist from the fall is thick, shrouding the area in a damp, eerie veil. I can hear the creature's heavy footfalls drawing nearer, the sound growing louder with each passing second. My heart hammers against my ribcage, threatening to burst. In a split-second decision, I dart towards a small overhang near the base of the waterfall. It's a gamble, but it's the only chance I have. The ground is slippery, treacherous, and I struggle to maintain my balance as I move. Just as I reach the overhang, a terrifying realization hits me: it's a dead end. The rocky wall looms high, offering no escape. I feel utterly cornered, trapped. The creature's growls are now just meters away, its menacing presence looming over me. Panic grips me, the fear so intense it's almost paralyzing. My mind races through every possible scenario, but none offer a way out. I brace myself, ready to face the creature, when suddenly a pair of strong, calloused hands grabs me from behind, covering my mouth. My initial impulse is to struggle, to fight against this new threat, but the hands are insistent, pulling me towards the cascading waterfall. I plunge into the veil of water, a cold, blinding torrent that disorients me further. Is this another threat, or an unexpected ally? As I'm pulled through the cascading waterfall, the cool water envelops me, sending shockwaves through my already exhausted body. The sensation is disorienting, like being caught in a relentless storm. I can hardly see or breathe, but the strong grip on my arms guides me steadily through the torrent. We emerge into a narrow, cramped crevice, hidden behind the waterfall. The space is barely large enough for two people, and I'm pressed close to the stranger in the confined area. The sound of the fall roars just outside, muffling any other noise. The stranger, still gripping my arms, finally releases me and spins me around to face him. I find myself face to face with a young Aboriginal man. His features are strong, weathered by the elements. His eyes are alert, his expression serious but not unkind. He's dressed like a traditional hunter-gatherer, reminiscent of the figures I've seen in history textbooks. His skin is painted with intricate designs, symbols that speak of a deep connection to the land and its lore. He's armed with traditional weapons, including a spear and a boomerang, hanging from a belt made of woven plant fibers. He seems like a man out of time. For a moment, we just stare at each other, both catching our breath. He gestures to me to stay silent, his finger to his lips. The young man, his movements swift and deliberate, reaches into a small leather pouch at his side. He pulls out a handful of fine, ochre-colored powder. Without a word, he spits into the powder, mixing it with practiced ease. He starts smearing the gritty paste over my face, hair, and clothes. His hands are gentle yet efficient, covering every exposed bit of skin. The paste smells like a blend of native plants and herbs, an earthy and almost comforting aroma. As he works, he pauses ever so slightly over my face. There's a flicker of surprise in his eyes, a brief but unmistakable reaction to my fair complexion, so different from his own. But he quickly regains his composure and continues his task. The stranger finishes applying the paste just as the heavy footfalls of the creature grow dangerously close. He draws his spear, his body tensing, ready for the confrontation. His eyes flicker to mine, a silent message to stay quiet and still. Then, piercing through the cacophony, I hear it, a voice so familiar it sends shivers down my spine. "My little wren, are you there?" It calls, using the secret nickname only my father ever used. The voice is warm, comforting, yet utterly impossible. Every instinct in me wants to rush towards the sound, towards the memory of safety and love that voice represents. I take a step forward, my heart aching with a mixture of hope and disbelief. But the stranger's hand grips my arm firmly, holding me back. His eyes, intense and fearful, meet mine. In them, I see a warning, a plea not to give in to the illusion. The voice outside, rich and familiar, continues to beckon. "It's me, Big Eagle. Don't be afraid." The use of my father's nickname for himself sends a wave of nostalgia and confusion over me. It's as though the past and the present are colliding in this surreal moment. The voice grows more insistent, pleading now. "Willow, please come out. I've missed you, love." It's almost too much to bear, hearing these words from a man I believed was gone forever from my life. The voice outside shifts, no longer just my father's, but now intertwined with the soft tones of a woman and the playful chatter of a child. They speak in a language unfamiliar to me, their words flowing like a gentle stream, melodic and haunting. The voices, though soothing, carry an undercurrent of something sinister, an attempt to lure us from our hiding. My companion clenches his jaw, his hand tightens around the shaft of his spear. I can see the conflict raging within him, a desperate fight against the urge to respond to these ghostly calls. The creature's snot, a grotesque mix of scales and sinew, pushes through the narrow opening of our hiding place. Its breath is hot and foetid, filling the confined space with an oppressive stench. It sniffs around, probing closer and closer to where we crouch in silent terror. I hold my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible. The creature's snout comes mere centimeters from my face, its nostrils flaring as it searches for a scent. My heart pounds so loudly in my chest, I'm afraid it'll give us away. But the paste smeared all over me seems to mask my scent, disguising my foreign smell with the earthy tones of the Australian bush. The creature hesitates, sniffing the air with confusion. It's as if it senses our presence but can't quite pinpoint where we are. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the creature withdraws its snout from the crevice. Its frustrated growls and heavy footsteps recede as it continues its search elsewhere. Time seems to stretch on endlessly. For a moment, neither of us moves, still reeling from the close encounter. Every sound, every shift in the air sets my nerves on edge. But gradually, the oppressive sense of danger begins to fade. The creature's growls and footsteps, once so menacingly close, are now distant echoes. Finally, after what feels like hours, the young man relaxes his posture slightly. His sharp gaze softens as he turns to me, nodding slightly. It's a silent signal that it might be safe to leave our hiding place. We emerge cautiously from behind the waterfall, stepping out into the cool, misty air. The sun rising is just a sliver on the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow on the rugged landscape. The immediate area is quiet, the only sound being the water cascading down the rocks. The stranger gestures for me to follow him, moving with a stealth and grace that speaks of his deep familiarity with this land. We tread lightly, every step measured and deliberate, alert for any sign of the creature. As we move away from the waterfall, the young man suddenly stops and crouches down. He examines the ground closely, tracing a set of tracks with his fingers. They're large and deep, unmistakably those of the creature. Taking a hesitant step forward, I clear my throat softly. "Thank you," I say, my voice barely above a whisper, mindful of the lingering danger. "You saved my life." I pause, waiting for any sign of acknowledgement, but he continues his examination, unfazed. I try again, a bit louder this time. "Can you tell me your name?" Do you know what was that thing we just saw?" My questions hang in the air unanswered. He looks up at me with a perplexed expression, his brow furrowing slightly. In a low, cautious tone, he mutters something in a language I don't recognize. The words are fluid, rich with inflections that are unfamiliar to my ears. Garnering nothing but a blank stare from me, he returns to the tracks. His eyes widen as he picks up a piece of tattered fabric from one of the creature's paw prints. It's a small scrap, but clearly part of a garment, frayed and stained with what looks like dried blood. He holds it up, examining it closely, his expression one of concern. Suddenly, he turns to me and becomes animated, speaking rapidly in his native tongue. His words are a torrent of sounds and syllables that dance around me, completely foreign and incomprehensible. He points emphatically at the scraps, then to the tracks, and finally towards the dense bushland. I watch him, trying to decipher his meaning through his gestures and the urgency in his voice. It's clear he's trying to convey something crucial, something about the creature and perhaps its recent activities. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," I say, my voice tinged with frustration. "Can you please just speak to me in English?" It doesn't even occur to me at the time that he might not know English. He stares at me, his expression hard to read. For a moment, he seems to be weighing his options, his gaze shifting from me to the wilderness around us. Then, without another word, he turns and storms off into the bushland. His departure is swift, a clear sign of his annoyance, or perhaps his need to act quickly. For a moment, I'm stunned, left standing in the early morning light, the sounds of the wilderness enveloping me. The sense of isolation is palpable, and the memory of the creature's terrifying presence is still fresh in my mind. Shaking off my hesitation, I start to follow him. My injuries protest with each step, but the danger of being alone in this environment, especially with that creature out there, overrides my discomfort. "Wheat," I call out, my voice echoing slightly in the open space. Catching up to him, I try to keep pace, my breathing heavy from the exertion and pain. We should stick together, I say, more to myself than to him. Especially with that thing out there. He doesn't stop, but I notice he's not moving as fast as he could. It seems like he's consciously slowing down his pace, allowing me to follow close behind despite my injured state. He continues forward, muttering something under his breath in his language. It's a stream of words I can't understand, but the tone suggests distress. We trek through the rugged wilderness, the landscape a blur of reds and greens through my increasingly hazy vision. The throbbing in my head, a dull ache at first, grows into an insistent, pulsating pain. It feels like a drumbeat, relentless and overpowering. My steps become unsteady, each movement sending waves of nausea and dizziness through me. As we navigate the dense underbrush, my vision starts to double, the world around me splitting and merging in a disorienting dance. I blink rapidly, trying to clear my sight, but it only seems to worsen. The edges of my vision darken, the encroaching shadows narrowing my field of view. I can feel the heat of the sun on my back, the sweat trickling down my spine, but it's as if I'm moving through a thick fog. My ears ring, the sounds of the bush muted and distant. I try to focus on the young man leading the way, his figure now a nondescript silhouette in front of me. I want to call out, to tell him that something is wrong, but my tongue feels heavy, my throat dry. With each step, the pain in my head spikes, a sharp contrast to the numbness that starts to creep into my limbs. I stumble, my feet tangling in the underbrush, and my hand reaches out, grasping for support. But there's nothing to hold on to. My knees buckle, and I feel myself falling. The ground rushes up to meet me, a collision that seems both imminent and surreal. In that moment, a wave of helplessness washes over me, a sense of impending doom. But the impact never comes. Instead, there's a sudden, jarring halt as strong arms catch me, preventing me from crashing to the earth. I barely register the sensation of being lifted, my body too heavy, too disconnected from my mind. The last thing I remember is the sensation of being carried, the steady rhythm of footsteps, a faint echo in the growing darkness of my mind. As I slowly regain consciousness, the world comes back into focus with a soft blur. The gentle sway of leaves above me creates a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. I'm lying on a bed of green foliage under a sprawling eucalyptus tree, its distinct, aromatic scent filling the air around me. I try to sit up, but a sharp pain in my head forces me back down. That's when I notice the stranger sitting beside me, his watchful eyes fixed on my face. He holds out a container, crafted from the bark of a tree, filled with clear, cool water. With his help, I manage to take a few sips, the water bringing a much-needed relief to my parched throat. He then gently examines my head, his fingers probing with a careful, practiced touch. There's a tenderness in his actions. He's collected various plants and herbs, some of which I recognize as native remedies. With skilled hands, he starts to apply a poultice to my head wound. The cool mixture stings at first, but soon a soothing sensation replaces the pain. Once he's done, he sits back, giving me space. His gaze wanders to the horizon, lost in thoughts I can't begin to comprehend. I take the opportunity to observe him more closely. His face, etched with lines of experience, tells a story of a life lived in harmony with nature. His eyes, dark and deep, reflect a world that is both beautiful and brutal. Gathering my strength, I make another attempt to communicate with the stranger. "Thanks again. My name's Willow, by the way," I say, hand outstretched. His expression remains stoic, his eyes revealing nothing. "Do you understand me?" I ask tentatively, my voice weak but hopeful. He watches me, his face unreadable. He doesn't respond, and it becomes increasingly clear that he might not understand English. This realization strikes me as odd. Even the most isolated Aboriginal communities have some exposure to English. As I lie there, pondering our communication barrier, I observe him more closely. His attire, his tools, The way he interacts with the environment, it all seems different. Not just traditional, but ancient, untouched by the modern world. A thought begins to form in my mind, a possibility so incredible that it borders on the fantastical. Could he be from an uncontacted people? I sit up, contemplating the possibility, my mind racing. I've heard stories about the Pintupi Nine, the group of indigenous Australians who walked out of the desert in 1984, having lived in isolation from the outside world. But that was nearly 40 years earlier. And the idea of stumbling upon an uncontacted tribe in Australia in 2023 seems almost as unbelievable as the monstrous creature we'd just encountered. Yet, as I watch him methodically tend to the surrounding area, arranging stones, checking the wind direction, and occasionally glancing at the sky, I can't help but wonder. He notices my scrutiny and meets my gaze. There's a brief moment where our eyes lock, a silent exchange. Humoring the possibility, I point to myself using slow, deliberate gestures. "Willow," I repeat, tapping my chest. He watches, his expression thoughtful. Then, mimicking my action, he taps his own chest and says, "Jira." My companion has a name, and it's Jira. Ecstatic at the breakthrough, my heart leaps. "Jira," I repeat, a smile breaking through my pain and exhaustion. It's a small connection, but it feels monumental, like a bridge across the unfathomable chasm between us. But then, a grim thought crosses my mind, casting a shadow over my brief moment of joy. Here I am, a modern woman with all the germs and microbes of a world far removed from Jira's. The sudden realization hits me hard. I could be a walking, talking petri dish of pathogens to which he might have no immunity. Memories of historical accounts where explorers and settlers inadvertently introduced diseases to indigenous populations flash through my mind. The consequences were often catastrophic. A shiver runs down my spine at the thought of being responsible for such a tragedy. I rummage through my first aid kit. My fingers, still slightly unsteady from my recent ordeal, search for a face mask. Finding one, I quickly put it on, securing it firmly over my nose and mouth. I can't completely eliminate the risk, but I can minimize it. Jira watches me with a mix of curiosity and confusion. He doesn't understand the reason behind this strange new addition to my face, but he remains silent, his eyes following my every move. I reach back into my backpack, gingerly pulling out my notebook. It's a bit damp from our earlier plunge through the waterfall, but the contents are mostly intact. Flipping through the pages, I find what I'm looking for: photos of me in Perth. I show Jira the pictures, pointing to the tall buildings, the crowded streets, and the images of me in various urban settings. I tap the photo and then point to myself, trying to convey that this is where I come from. "Home," I say slowly. "That's where I'm from." Jira leans in, his eyes scanning the images with a mix of wonder and perplexity. He touches the photos lightly, tracing the outlines of the skyscrapers and the unfamiliar faces in the pictures. He looks up at me, then back at the photo, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Encouraged by Jira's reaction, I flip to a blank page in my notebook. Taking out a pen, I demonstrate its use, drawing a simple outline of the terrain we're in. I then hand the pen to Jira, gesturing towards the notebook and then at the photos. I want him to draw where he's from, to share a part of his world as I've shared mine. Jira takes the pen, examining it with a curious gaze. He tentatively places the tip on the paper and starts to draw. His movements are cautious at first, but they soon become more fluid, revealing a natural talent for expression. A village emerges on the page. He adds several huts, arranged in a circle, and a larger central structure that seems to be a communal area. He adds a figure, presumably himself, depicted as walking away from the village. The figure is alone, separate from the other elements of the drawing, imparting a sense of solitude and departure. I'm no anthropologist, but through my schooling and cultural sensitivity training as a ranger, I've learned about various aspects of Aboriginal cultures. One concept that comes to mind is that of the walkabout. a rite of passage in which young Aboriginal men embark on a journey into the wilderness, living off the land for a period to transition into manhood and gain spiritual enlightenment. As I ponder over Jira's drawing, the eerie encounter with the creature still looms large in my thoughts. I decide to communicate this experience with Jira, hoping he might have some insight or knowledge about what we faced. I start sketching the creature as best as I can recall. The grotesque features, the scaly skin, the malevolent eyes, I try to capture every detail that's etched into my memory. My hand trembles slightly as I draw, the image stirring renewed terror. Finishing the sketch, I turn the notebook to show Jira. "Do you know what this is?" I ask. His reaction is immediate and intense. His eyes widen, and he recoils slightly, a look of recognition and fear crossing his face. He begins speaking rapidly, his voice urgent. One word stands out, repeated several times with emphasis: Bunyip. Jira's hand shakes as he takes the notebook from me. His eyes locked on the sketch of the bunyip. With a sense of urgency, he begins drawing a line from the monstrous figure to the village he had depicted earlier. The line he draws is jagged, almost erratic, as if to symbolize the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the bunyip. He taps the line repeatedly, his eyes meeting mine with a piercing intensity. It's clear to me now why he was in such a rush. He fears the bunyip is heading towards his village, or worse, that it might already be there. Jira and I sit in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The revelation of the bunyip, a creature of Aboriginal legend, now terrifyingly real, hangs heavy between us. The urgency in Jira's eyes tells me that we can't delay. His village might be in danger. As I test my strength, I find the sharp pains have dulled to a manageable atch. My head still throbs, but the world no longer spins uncontrollably. I nod to Jira, signaling that I'm ready to move. He offers me a hand, pulling me to my feet. We set out at a steady pace, Jira leading the way. He moves with a quiet confidence, each step purposeful. I follow closely, relying on my ranger training to keep up. Our journey is mostly silent, the only sounds being our footsteps and the distant calls of birds and insects. Every so often, Jira pauses to examine the ground or the brush, ensuring we're not walking into danger. His vigilance is both reassuring and a reminder of the perils we face. We travel throughout the day, the sun charting its relentless course across the sky. Our only respite comes in brief, stolen moments of rest under the shade of sparse trees or rocky outcrops. Each time we stop, it's for no more than a few minutes, just long enough to catch our breath and sip sparingly from our dwindling water supply. The terrain varies as we move, from flat, open plains to rocky ridges and shallow valleys. The landscape is harsh but breathtaking in its raw beauty. As dusk approaches, the sky transforms into a canvas of deep oranges and purples, the sun dipping below the horizon. The beauty of the sunset is a contrast to the exhaustion that clings to us like a second skin. My body aches with every step. It's been over 24 hours since I've slept, the events of the day blurring into a relentless, adrenaline-fueled ordeal. My eyes sting from fatigue, my movements slower, less precise. I glance over at Jira. His endurance is remarkable, but the signs of fatigue are there, subtle but unmistakable. The slight droop in his shoulders, the brief moments where his pace slows, the faint lines of strain around his eyes, all indicators that he too is pushing his limits. I gesture to him, miming sleep with my hands clasped together and resting my cheek against them. "We should rest," I say, my voice a hoarse whisper in the growing twilight. His response is immediate and firm, a shake of the head, a determined look in his eyes. He's set on continuing, driven by the urgency to protect his village. I understand his concern, but I know too well the dangers of pushing our bodies beyond their limits. We need to sleep, even for just a little while. I insist, hoping my tone gets my meaning across. We'll be no good to anyone if we collapse from exhaustion. Jira hesitates, clearly torn between the need to press on and the reality of our physical limits. His eyes betray a moment of vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of my words. Yet, he nods curtly, signaling his decision to continue regardless. Navigating under the starlit sky, Jira often pauses, tilting his head upwards. In these moments, I notice him aligning our path with the Southern Cross, using the constellation as a guide through the dark. As the darkness deepens, our journey becomes increasingly perilous. The lack of light turns every shadow into a potential threat. Every rustle in the bush a cause for alarm. I keep a close eye on him, aware that in this state, even a seasoned tracker like Jira is susceptible to the dangers of the wilderness. It happens suddenly. Jira steps onto a loose stone on a narrow ridge, his foot sliding out from under him. He stumbles, his arms flailing for balance, but fatigue has robbed him of his usual grace. For a heart-stopping moment, he teeters on the edge of a steep drop. Without thinking, I lunge forward, grabbing his arm and pulling him back with all my strength. The sudden motion sends a jolt of pain through my injured wrist, but I barely register it. We both tumble to the ground, a tangle of limbs just centimeters from the precipice. For a moment, we lie there, panting heavily, the realization of what almost happened settling in. Jira sits up slowly, his gaze lingering on the edge of the ridge, then turns to me. There's a newfound respect in his eyes, an acknowledgement of our mutual reliance. He nods slowly, conceding to the necessity of rest. We find a small, sheltered area nestled between two large boulders, providing some protection from the elements and any roaming wildlife. Jira sets to work immediately, gathering dry twigs and leaves while I use my lighter to start a fire. The flames catch quickly, casting a warm, reassuring glow in the encroaching darkness. As the fire crackles and pops, Jira reaches into his pouch and brings out something wrapped in leaves. He unwraps it carefully, revealing a small portion of smoked meat and some native berries. He hands me a portion with a nod. I humbly accept his offering. The food, though simple, tasted delicious to my empty stomach. In return, I open my backpack and take out some of my emergency rations, a couple of energy bars and a packet of dried fruit and nuts. I offer them to Jira, watching as he examines them with curiosity before tentatively tasting them. He seems pleasantly surprised by the flavors, nodding his approval. After we finish our meal, a comfortable silence settles between us, broken only by the crackling of the fire. I watch the flames dance, their warmth soothing my aching body. As I sit there, I'm struck by a deep sense of gratitude towards Jira for saving me from the bunyip. I feel a compelling need to express my thanks in a tangible way. I dig through my backpack, my fingers brushing past various items, until they find what I'm looking for, my Swiss Army knife. Holding it out to Jira, I say, "I want you to have this." My voice is firm, underscored with sincerity. "Asa, thank you for saving my life." I take a moment to demonstrate its various tools, the knife, the screwdriver, the tiny scissors, and the can opener. Jira looks at the knife, his eyes tracing its contours. He takes it, turning it over in his hands, examining its various functions. He seems to understand its value, not just as a tool but as a gesture of gratitude and respect. In response, Jira reaches for something tied to his belt. It's his boomerang, its surface smooth and worn from use. The wood is dark, rich in color, and adorned with intricate carvings that tell a story I can't decipher. He offers it to me with solemn dignity. I accept the weapon with a sense of awe and reverence, my fingers gently tracing the intricate carvings etched into its surface. "Thanks, mate," I say, my voice thick with emotion. "I promise to cherish this." Jira nods, a faint smile touching his lips, his eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Jira sits close to the fire, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the flickering flames. As the night deepens, his eyelids droop occasionally, and his head nods forward before he snaps back to alertness. I notice his struggle. Through a series of gestures, I suggest taking turns sleeping, ensuring one of us is always on the lookout. I tap my chest and then point to the surrounding darkness, indicating that I'll take the first watch while he rests. At first, Jira resists, but after a few more insistent gestures from me, he gives in. He arranges himself on the ground, using his pouch as a makeshift pillow. His eyes linger on me for a moment, an unspoken thanks. Before he finally closes them, as I keep watch, I take out my notebook and begin jotting down the events of the day. I pause occasionally, glancing at Jira to ensure he's still sleeping peacefully, and then at the surrounding darkness, half expecting the nightmarish creature to reappear. I don't know when I fell asleep, but my exhaustion must have overtaken me. In the silence of the outback night, with Jira resting beside me, I drift into a dream. It's vivid, filled with the sharp clarity of memories that have long been etched in my heart. I'm 15 again, back in Cape Range National Park, under the vast expanse of the starlit sky. The air is crisp, filled with the scent of eucalyptus and the distant sound of the ocean. Dad and I are sitting by the campfire, just like we've done countless times before. He's telling me about one of his adventures. It's during one of these stories that I find the courage to break the news to him. Dad. I start hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper. Mum's getting remarried. The words hang in the air, heavy with the weight of change they carry. He doesn't react immediately, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighs, a sound that seems to carry a weight of unspoken thoughts. I see, he finally says. I'm happy for her. His voice is steady, but I can hear the faintest trace of something else in it, maybe sadness, maybe resignation. He looks at me, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames, a mix of emotions playing across his features. I hope he makes her happy, he adds, his voice tinged with a bittersweet edge. His heart is so torn that it breaks mine. I rush in, the words tumbling out in a torrent. I can't stand him. Mark, he's just... I struggle to find the right words to express how much I loathe my future stepfather, but they all fall short. He's not you. I finish lamely, feeling a profound sadness. You know, Ren, he says, using his special nickname for me. Sometimes people come into our lives, and we don't get to choose. What matters is how we respond to them. I feel a surge of frustration, mixed with a desperate longing for an escape. I could run away. It'll be just you and me. We can live out here away from everything. He chuckles softly, a sound that seems both sad and fun. You're my wild spirit, he says. But life isn't about running away. It's about facing what comes and finding your path through it. He sees the tears brimming in my eyes, a mix of frustration and youthful defiance. Hey, I got you something for your birthday, he says, gently changing the subject, reaching into his backpack. He pulls out the leather-bound notebook, the same one I've been carrying during my ordeal. For all your adventures, big and small, he adds with a smile. I wipe away my tears and take the notebook, tracing my fingers over its cover. He looks at me, his eyes softening. You know that I love you, right? He asks. That I do everything in my power to make sure you're not hurt. I lean into him, wrapping my arms around his sturdy frame. Of course I know, Dad. I say, my voice muffled against his jacket. I love you too. You're going to be all right, Willow, he says softly. No matter what life throws your way, remember you're stronger than you think. The dream shifts, the warmth of the campfire replaced by the chilling cold of dawn. I wake to find my father gone, his sleeping bag empty, his boots still by the fire. Panic grips me, a tight knot in my stomach. I call out for him, my voice breaking the morning stillness, but there's no response. I scramble to my feet, my heart racing. The notebook falls from my lap, landing open on the ground. The memories of our last night together swirl in my mind, a mix of love and foreboding. The campsite is undisturbed, his belongings left as if he intended to return. But there's an eerie silence, a sense of absence that's palpable. I grab a flashlight and start searching the surrounding area, the beam of light cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. I call his name over and over, my voice growing hoarse. The landscape is unyielding, offering no clues, no signs of his passage. I stumble upon a small clearing, and there, in the dirt, are footprints. They're his. I'm sure of it. My heart leaps with a mixture of hope and dread. As I follow the tracks, the terrain becomes more rugged, the earth giving way to limestone. The footprints lead directly to a cliff face, the ground ending abruptly in a sheer drop to the ocean below. There at the edge, the footprints come to an abrupt halt. No signs of return, no further path to follow. My breath catches in my throat, a silent sob trapped in the cage of my ribs. The implications hang in the air, heavy and unspoken. The cold, gray light of dawn casts long shadows across the ground. Shadows that seem to stretch into the void below. I inch closer, peering over the edge with a mix of fear and desperation. But there's nothing to see, just the endless expanse of water meeting sky. A horizon that offers no answers, only questions. A deep, hollow feeling settles in my chest, a void where hope used to reside. I fall to my knees, the damp earth clinging to my pajama pants. My father, my mentor and guide, chose to walk away from everything from me. Suddenly, amidst the oppressive silence, a familiar voice calls out from behind me. Willow. I whirl around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, against all logic, stands my dad. He looks the same, the early morning light casting familiar shadows across his face. Disbelief, relief, and skepticism war within me. Dead. My voice is a whisper, tinged with a hope I'm afraid to fully embrace. He steps forward, his presence undeniably real. I'm here, little Wren, he says, his voice carrying the warmth I remember so well. I step forward, each movement filled with a mix of fear and longing. How is this possible? I ask, my voice trembling. He opens his arms, a gesture of reassurance and comfort. I've always been here. You just had to find me. I step towards him, drawn by the familiarity and warmth of his presence. Yet, as I move closer, a sense of unease creeps into my heart. Something about his appearance, his aura, feels off. What happened to you? I ask, my voice laced with doubt. You've grown strong, Willow. He smiles, but it's a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. But are you strong enough to face the truth? Dad, you're scaring me, I whisper, my heart pounding. His smile widens, but it's not the warm, comforting expression I remember. Instead, it twists into something mocking, a grin that sends shivers down my spine. Suddenly, he erupts into laughter, a sound so jarring and inhuman that it freezes me in place. The laughter echoes around us, bouncing off the cliffs and filling the air with a sinister resonance. As I watch in horror, my dad's form begins to shift, to contort in ways that defy reality. His skin ripples and bulges, his features distorting grotesquely. I take a step back, my breath caught in my throat. The man who was my father is transforming, his body expanding and twisting into a monstrous shape. The familiar features melt away, revealing the scaly mottled skin of the bunyip. Its eyes, glowing a deep, malevolent red, fix on me with a terrifying intensity. Desperation and fear grip me, but they also bring a lucid clarity. This isn't real. I'm having a nightmare. I need to wake up. Just as the gullish creature prepares to lunge at me, a primal, instinctive part of my mind screams at me to take drastic steps to jolt myself awake. I glance over the edge of the cliff, the drop seeming like an endless chasm into the abyss. It's a terrifying choice, but it's the only way I can think of to break free from this horrific dream. Taking a deep breath, I step back, gathering every ounce of courage and resolve within me. With a final, defiant glance at the monster, I sprint off the cliff's edge. I can feel the rush of air, the sensation of weightlessness as I fall off the cliff. It's a terrifying, exhilarating moment, a leap into the unknown. My stomach churns, my heart races, every sense heightened to an almost unbearable intensity. The water below seems to rush up to meet me, the vast expanse of ocean a blur of color and motion. But before I can brace for impact, I'm jolted awake. It's a sudden, violent awakening, my body lurching upright as if pulled by unseen strings. My breath comes in ragged gasps, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I'm disoriented, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to me like a cold mist. It's early morning, the first light of dawn casting a soft glow on the surrounding landscape. The fire has died down to embers, its warmth a fading memory. I'm back in the outback. The nightmare of the cliff and the monstrous bunyip fading into the surreal world of dreams. But a new panic sets in as I quickly realize that Jira is nowhere to be seen. His sleeping spot is empty, the ground still bearing the imprint of his body. My eyes dart around the campsite, searching for any sign of him, any clue to where he might have gone. His belongings are still here, just like my dad's were that morning when I discovered he was gone. My heart sinks, and a wave of desolation washes over me. Did Jira, too, choose to walk away? Why would he leave without a word? Especially after everything we've been through together. My mind races through possibilities, each more disheartening than the last. Did he sense some danger and go to investigate? Or did he simply decide that our paths no longer aligned, leaving me to face the wilderness alone? I stand up, my body stiff and sore from the restless sleep and the events of the past days. My first instinct is to call out for him, but I restrain myself, aware that any noise might attract unwanted attention, perhaps even from the bunyip itself. I start to pace around the campsite, scanning the area for any clues. There are tracks leading away. They're Jira's. I recognize the unique pattern of his footprints. They head off into the bushland, but there's no clear indication of why he left or where he might be going. But then, just as the sun fully breaks the horizon, casting long shadows on the red earth, I see a figure approaching. It's Jira, his stride confident, carrying something in his hand. A flood of relief washes over me. As he comes closer, I notice he's carrying a dead sangona, the monitor lizard's long, slender body limp in his grasp. In his other hand, he holds a collection of wild herbs, freshly gathered. Jira lays the items down near the remnants of our campfire. He meets my gaze briefly, a flicker of something akin to an apology in his eyes, before he gets to work. He carefully extracts the venom from the gona, his movements precise and skilled. The venom, a potent neurotoxin, is something I've read about in my ranger training but never seen handled in person. With deliberate care, he mixes the venom with the herbs he gathered, grinding them together with a small, flat stone. The mixture becomes a thick, dark paste, its consistency perfect for his purpose. Jira looks up at me, his eyes communicating a silent warning of the mixture's lethal nature. Then, with a steady hand, he applies the paste to the tip of his spear, ensuring an even coating. I watch, captivated by the demonstration of a skill passed down through generations, a skill that has likely saved his life more than once. He then turns to the Swiss Army knife I had gifted him, applying the same mixture to its blade with deliberate care. Curious about his actions, I hold up the boomerang he had given me, raising an inquiring eyebrow. This too? I ask. Jira nods in confirmation. He carefully applies a thin layer of the venom, herb mixture along its edges, transforming the simple wooden tool into a deadly weapon. As Jira completes his meticulous preparation of our weapons, he suddenly gestures towards my notebook. I pick it up and hand it to him, along with the pen. He flips to a blank page and starts to sketch with a focused intensity. The lines he draws take shape, forming the image of the bunyip. He portrays it standing on its hind limbs, its menacing form dominating the page. Then, with precise strokes, Jira adds two smaller figures next to the creature, one holding a spear, the other with a boomerang. He points to a specific spot on the creature's underbelly in the drawing, circling it multiple times. It seems he's identified a vulnerability, a target for us to aim for in our battle against the creature. Jira says something in his language, his tone suggesting a question. Though I don't understand his words, his meaning is clear. He's asking if I comprehend the plan. I nod, meeting his gaze with grim determination. I understand, I reply. As we approach the vicinity of Jira village, the terrain changes subtly. The bushland gives way to a more open landscape. The village is nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by high ridges that offer both protection and isolation. It's a hidden gem, an oasis of calm in the harsh Australian wilderness. We approach the village with a growing sense of dread, the signs of devastation becoming increasingly apparent. The once vibrant community, as depicted in Jira's drawing, is now a scene of utter desolation. The air is thick with the acrid scent of smoke and something else, something far more sinister. Entering the perimeter of the village, the full extent of the tragedy unfolds before us. The huts are reduced to smoldering ruins. The communal areas are destroyed, their sacred grounds desecrated. The most disturbing sight, however, is the bodies. The men of the village, warriors and hunters, lie scattered across the landscape. Their final moments seem to tell a story of a fierce, desperate battle against an unimaginable foe. The marks on their bodies, deep gashes and wounds, match the fearsome characteristics of the bunyip we encountered. Jira moves through the village with a hollow, haunted look in his eyes. Each body he passes, he stops, his hands gently closing their eyes in a final act of respect and farewell. His grief is palpable, a silent scream of pain and loss that echoes through the empty village. I stand there, feeling utterly helpless, my heart heavy with sorrow for Jira and his people. I want to offer comfort, but words seem meaningless in the face of such devastation. Jira's steps grow heavier, laden with an unspeakable pain. He finally falls to his knees amidst the ruins, his entire frame shaking with silent sobs. It's a heart-wrenching sight, a proud and strong man, brought to the brink by the loss of everything he held dear. His anguished prayers, spoken in his native tongue, fill the air, a haunting melody of sorrow and despair. His grief is a tangible force, a raw, open wound that transcends language and culture. I recall the day I lost my dad, the confusion and heartache that followed. But Jira's loss is on a scale I can't even begin to comprehend. He's not just mourning a single person, he's grieving for his entire world, a community and way of life that has been torn away from him in the most brutal manner. Gently, I kneel beside him, offering my presence as a silent source of support. I place a tentative hand on his shoulder, unsure if my touch is welcome but feeling the need to bridge the gap of isolation that surrounds him. I wrap my arms around him in a comforting embrace. He leans into me, his cries muffled against my shoulder. "I'm here for you, Jira," I whisper softly, my voice barely above the whisper of the wind through the charred remains of his home. "You're not alone in this." The words feel inadequate, but they're all I have to offer in the face of such overwhelming sorrow. Jira's sobs subside abruptly as his attention shifts to something in the distance. Following his gaze, I notice a series of footprints amidst the devastated village. Unlike the chaotic scuffles and heavy tracks from the battle, these are smaller, more measured, possibly those of women and children. Jira stands up, his body language changing from one of defeat to determination. He gestures for me to follow, and starts tracking the footprints with a renewed sense of purpose. As we follow the trail, it becomes clear that these are not random or aimless tracks. They are purposeful, leading away from the carnage, deeper into the wilderness. The possibility that some of his people might have escaped the bunyip's wrath instills a new urgency in our steps. Jira and I venture deeper into the wilderness, the terrain becoming increasingly treacherous and unfamiliar. The tracks lead us through dense bushland, across rocky gorges, and along the banks of a serpentine river. The sun is high, casting sharp shadows that play tricks on our eyes. But we press on, driven by the hope of finding survivors. As the hours pass, a heavy silence settles over the land. It's as if nature itself is holding its breath, aware of the dark presence lurking nearby. The tracks lead us to the entrance of a vast cave network, hidden beneath an overhang of twisted roots and ancient stone. The mouth of the cave is wide and dark, an abyss that swallows the morning sunlight. Stalagmites and stalactites jut out like jagged teeth, giving the cave entrance the appearance of a massive, petrified beast. Jira pauses at the entrance, his eyes scanning the shadows within. There's an unspoken understanding between us that we might be walking into the very heart of danger. He places a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his gaze firm and resolute. Taking a deep breath, we both smear a final layer of the ochre paste over our faces to conceal our scent. Jira leads the way into the cave, his steps silent and cautious. I follow, every sense heightened, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside the cave, the atmosphere changes dramatically, as if stepping through a threshold into another realm. The air is cooler, the light dim, filtered through cracks and crevices in the rocky ceiling. The walls are adorned with ancient handprints that glow softly, emitting a spectral light that seems to pulse with a life of its own. I'm reminded of the Aboriginal concept of dream time, where the past, present, and future converge. The further we venture, the more the cave transforms. Stalactites hang from the ceiling like chandeliers. The haunting sound of a didgeridoo resonates through the cave, its deep, rhythmic drone vibrating in the air around us. The melody is both mournful and soothing. We follow the haunting sound of the didgeridoo, its resonance guiding us deeper into the cave. The path narrows, wending through towering stalagmites that rise from the ground like silent sentinels. The melody grows louder, its rhythmic pulse echoing off the cave walls. We turn a corner, and the cave opens into a large chamber, bathed in a soft, otherworldly light. The source of the light is a natural skylight, a gap in the rock through which the sun streams, casting a warm glow over the space. In the chamber, illuminated by the sun's gentle light, we find them, the survivors of Jira's village. Women, children, and a few elderly members of the tribe huddled together, their eyes wide. They're a small group, a mere fraction of the village's original population, but at least they're alive. The didgeridoo player, an elder with a weathered face and wise eyes, sits cross-legged near the group. As we enter, he pauses, his gaze shifting to us. There's a moment of tension, a silent assessment, before recognition dawns in his eyes. Jira rushes forward, his voice breaking as he calls out in his native tongue. The survivors respond with a mixture of shock and joy, their initial fear giving way to tearful reunions. Mothers clutch their children closer, tears streaming down their faces, while the elderly reach out to touch Jira, as if to assure themselves that he is real. I stand back, watching the emotional reunion, feeling both an outsider and a witness to something profoundly emotional. The children, curious and resilient despite the horrors they faced, begin to inch closer to me, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution. A young girl, no more than 5 or 6, bravely steps forward and offers me a shy smile. I kneel down and return her smile, touched by her gesture of friendship. "He there, sweetie," I say. She reaches out, her small fingers tentatively touching my curly blonde hair, mirroring her own. Her eyes widen in wonder, as if she's found a connection between us, a common thread in an otherwise unfamiliar world. I laugh softly, encouraging her curiosity. "It's just like yours, isn't it?" I say gently. The reunion, though heartwarming, is tragically short-lived. Just as the atmosphere begins to settle into one of cautious relief, a chilling sound pierces the air, echoing ominously through the cave. It's a deep, guttural growl. A sound so menacing and primal that it instantly sends a wave of terror through the chamber. The survivors freeze, their expressions morphing into ones of pure fear. The children huddle closer to their mothers, their small faces etched with terror. Jira's head snaps up, his eyes narrowing as he listens intently. The grim look on his face tells me all I need to know. The bunyip is close, perhaps closer than we dared to think. The sound reverberates through the cave, a relentless echo that seems to come from every direction, disorienting and confusing. We quickly begin organizing the survivors, directing them towards a narrow passageway at the back of the chamber. It's a tight squeeze, but it offers the only viable escape route. The bunyip's growls grow louder, more insistent. Its presence is like a tangible shadow, creeping closer with each passing second. The air in the cave becomes thick with tension, the fear almost palpable. Jira takes the lead, guiding the survivors through the passageway with quiet urgency. I follow at the rear, ensuring that no one is left behind. We move as quickly as we can, but the passage is narrow and winding, forcing us to proceed in a single file. The walls close in around us, the air thick and heavy. The only sound is the shuffling of feet and the occasional whimper of fear from the children. As we squirm our way through the confining passage, the sound of the bunyip scrolls intensifies, a constant, unnerving presence that seems to vibrate through the very walls of the cave. Its growls, low and resonant, echo around us, creating a disorienting cacophony of sound. The realization hits me with chilling clarity. The bunyip is using a form of echolocation, its growls bouncing off the walls and guiding it towards our location. Our group, huddled together and moving in mass, is like a beacon, reflecting the sound waves back to the creature. Jira and I exchange glances. We both understand we need to disperse the group to break the single mass that the bunyip sounds are bouncing off of. Jira communicates this to the survivors in hushed, urgent tones. We reach a wider chamber within the cave, a natural crossroads with 2 tunnels leading in different directions. Jira quickly assesses the situation and instructs the survivors to head down one tunnel, speaking with a quiet authority that spurs them into action. He then turns to me, his expression resolute. He points down the tunnel the survivors are taking, signaling for me to follow them. I nod in understanding, ready to follow the survivors to ensure their safety. But as I turn to leave, I notice Jira isn't joining us. Instead, he heads down another tunnel, banging his spear loudly against the walls. The understanding of what he's doing hits me instantly. He's acting as a decoy, drawing the bunyip's attention away from the group to give them a chance to escape. I hesitate for a moment, torn between the instinct to survive and the knowledge that Jira is knowingly walking into grave danger. But as he disappears into the darkness of the tunnel, I can't bring myself to leave him behind. After everything we've endured together, the idea of abandoning him to face the bunyip alone is unthinkable. I quickly turn back, following Jira's path. As I catch up to him, he whirls around, his expression one of frustration. He shakes his head, gesturing emphatically for me to go with the others. But I stand firm, meeting his gaze. "I'm not leaving you," I say, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "We'll face this together." But Jira starts to protest, but he sees the resolve in my eyes. He reluctantly nods, understanding that I won't be swayed. The path twists and turns, leading us deeper into the heart of the cave. As we move, the ceiling gradually rises, opening into a larger chamber with high, vaulted ceilings. Stalagmites jut out from the ground, creating a natural labyrinth. The growls of the bunyip grow louder, more frenzied. It's as if the creature is closing in on us from all sides, its presence felt but not yet seen. The anticipation is almost as terrifying as the creature itself, a life or death game of cat and mouse. As we move forward, the air in the cave grows colder, a chill that seems to seep into my bones. Jira and I exchange tense glances, our hands gripping our weapons tightly, ready for the confrontation we know is coming. Suddenly, without warning, the ground in front of us explodes in a shower of rocks and dust. The bunyip bursts forth from the earth. Its mottled green skin glistens in the faint light, and its malevolent red eyes fixate on us with chilling intensity. The creature is larger and more terrifying than I remembered, its presence dominating the chamber. The bunyip circles us, its movements deceptively agile for its size. It's toying with us, enjoying the game of predator and prey. Jira and I, despite our determination, are painfully aware of our disadvantage. We're fighting a creature of legend, a being that embodies the very essence of the wilderness's unforgiving nature. We dash through the maze of stalagmites, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Our strategy is simple yet fraught with risk: keep moving, stay unpredictable, and look for an opening to strike. The stalagmites provide temporary cover, but they also hinder our movement, forcing us to weave and dodge through the tight spaces. I glance back, catching a glimpse of the bunyip closing in. Its massive body scrapes against the stone, its claws leaving deep gashes in the earth. We take a sharp turn, hoping to lose the creature in the twisted pathways. But as we round a bend, the bunyip appears before us, blocking our path. Jira lunges forward, his spear aimed at the creature's underbelly, the spot he had marked in his drawing. But the creature dodges Jira's thrusts, its movements eerily agile. It counters with a swipe of its massive claw, narrowly missing Jira, who jumps out of the way at the last second. I rush forward, swinging the boomerang gifted me with all my might. The creature turns its attention to me, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. I strike, the boomerang connecting with a sickening thud against its thick hide. But it's like hitting a wall of stone, the creature barely flinches. The bunyip launches at me, its massive jaws open wide, revealing rows of ray-sharp teeth. I roll to the side, narrowly avoiding its bite. The creature's tail whips around, catching me off guard and sending me sprawling to the ground. Jira, seeing me in danger, rushes to my aid. He swings his spear with precision. The bunyip, sensing the threat, pivots swiftly, disarming Jira with a powerful flick of its paw. The spear clatters to the ground, just out of his reach. The creature turns its full wrath on Jira, pinning him to the ground with its massive form. In a desperate move, Jira reaches for the Swiss Army knife I gave him. With all his strength, he plunges the knife into the creature's side. The bunyip recoils with a deafening roar, releasing Jira from its grasp. Dark blood oozes from the wound, a clear sign that Jira's attack has found its mark. But it's not enough. The creature, though wounded, is still a formidable force, its eyes burning with rage. Holding the boomerang in my hands, I feel its weight and balance in my hands. It's nothing like the toy boomerangs I've thrown before. This is a weapon honed for survival. The bunyip doesn't notice me regaining my footing. My eyes dart around, desperately seeking an advantage. Then I see it, a massive, jagged stalactite hanging precariously above where the bunyip stands. It's a long shot, but it's all we have. In that moment, time seems to slow down. I can hear my heart pounding in my ears, the sound of my breath ragged and quick. I think of my father, of the lessons he taught me about facing fear head-on. Channeling every ounce of strength and focus I possess, I hurl the boomerang with all my might. The boomerang cuts through the air, whistling as it arcs towards its target. My heart races as it nears its target, the moment stretching out, each second a lifetime. With a resounding crack, the boomerang strikes the stalactite. The impact sends a shudder through the cavern, a vibration that resonates through the very bones of the earth. The stone, already teetering on the edge of stability, begins to break free from the ceiling. The bunyip, sensing the danger, looks up just as the massive formation detaches, plummeting towards it with the force of gravity. There's no time for it to react, no time to escape. The stalactite crashes down upon the creature with a thunderous roar, engulfing it in a cloud of dust and debris. The jagged shards of stone pierce through the bunyip's tough, scaly skin. The creature lets out an earth-shattering roar, a sound filled with pain and fury. It writhes violently, its massive body struggling under the weight of the stone protruding from it, exposing its soft underbelly in a desperate attempt to free itself. Jira, seizing the moment, retrieves his spear from where it had fallen. He sets it in a spear thrower, a simple but effective tool that amplifies the force and distance of his throw. In a fluid, almost poetic motion, Jira draws back his arm and launches the spear. The spear flies through the air with deadly accuracy, its trajectory unerring. The silence of the cavern is pierced by the sound of the projectile cutting through the air, a whistle that seems to reverberate with the weight of the moment. The spear strikes true, burying itself deep into the bunyip's heart. The bunyip lets out a final, ear-splitting roar of pain and fury, its body convulsing as the life drains from it. For a few tense moments, the creature thrashes wildly, but each movement grows weaker. Dark, viscous blood pools around it, seeping into the earth. The bunyip's convulsions slowly subside, its massive form collapsing under the weight of its injuries. In a haunting transformation, the monster's grotesque visage morphs, revealing a face I know all too well, my father's. He looks at me with eyes filled with sorrow and pain, his voice echoing through the cavern. "Willow, my little wren, help me," he pleads, his voice a perfect imitation of my dad's. The illusion is so convincing, so heartbreakingly real, that for a moment, I'm frozen. My heart torn between reality and the desperate longing to see my father again. Tears well up in my eyes, a mix of grief and anger. This abomination dares to use my father's voice to prey on my deepest sorrows and fears. "You're not him," I say. "He's gone. You can't use his memory against me." The creature, sensing my wavering, continues in my father's voice. "Willow, it's me. I'm here. I've always been here for you." "Dad," I say, my voice trembling but resolutely, "you chose to leave. And I've accepted that you're gone forever. You killed yourself, and nothing can change that." Jera, sensing my pain and seeing through the bunyip's deceit, steps forward with a resolute expression. He pulls out his spear from the creature's chest and, without hesitation, plunges it into its throat. As the spear pierces its throat, the bunyip's illusion shatters. The image of my father fades away, leaving behind the true form of the creature, a monstrous amalgamation of nightmares. Its body shudders violently before finally going still, the light fading from its malevolent red eyes. The cavern falls silent, save for the echoes of our labored breaths and the distant drip of water from the stalactites. I stand there, breathing heavily, my emotions a tumultuous storm. Yet, there's a sense of closure, a finality that brings with it a bitter form of peace. Jera places a comforting hand on my shoulder, his touch grounding me in the present. He looks into my eyes, his own reflecting a deep understanding of loss and the resilience required to overcome it. Jera and I make our way back towards the survivors. The ochre handprints on the walls seem to guide us, their ancient glow a comforting presence in the dim light. As we approach the chamber where we had left the survivors, the sound of their anxious murmurs reaches our ears. The moment we step in, all eyes turn to us. Jera speaks to his people in a calm, steady voice, explaining what transpired. I watch as a collective sense of relief washes over them. We lead the survivors out of the cave, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion, relief, and lingering fear. Emerging from the cavern's mouth, we are greeted by the blinding light of day. The sun, high in the sky, bathes us in its warm glow, a welcome reprieve from the cold shadows of the cave. We set up a temporary camp near the cave entrance, using the remains of our supplies to provide some comfort. Jera, with his intimate knowledge of the land, gathers additional resources, ensuring that everyone is hydrated and fed. Then, in the late afternoon, a distant sound catches my attention. It's faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable, the chop of helicopter blades. My heart leaps with hope. I shield my eyes with my hand, searching the sky. There, on the horizon, a speck appears, growing larger as it approaches. It's a search and rescue helicopter, its rotors slicing through the air with a steady rhythm. Relief washes over me, a wave of emotions that's hard to contain. As the helicopter draws closer, its presence sends a wave of panic through the survivors. They huddle closer together, their eyes wide with fear. This modern machine, so alien to their isolated existence, seems to them like another monster, perhaps more terrifying than the one we've just defeated. "It's okay," I say softly, speaking more with my eyes than my words. "They're here to help." Jera, sensing their unease, speaks to them in his native tongue, his tone gentle yet firm. Realizing that the helicopter might not easily spot us amidst the rugged terrain, I rummage through my backpack for a signal mirror. Finding it, I step into a clearing, angling the mirror towards the sun. The reflection catches the light, sending a bright, flashing signal towards the helicopter. The helicopter banks slightly, its course adjusting as it homes in on our location. It hovers above us, the downdraft from its rotors sending dust swirling around our makeshift camp. In the days and weeks following the dramatic rescue, the world I knew and the world Jira and his people knew collided in a whirlwind of change, discovery, and inevitable challenges. The survivors, having lived in isolation, were suddenly thrust into a reality far removed from the only life they had known. The bright lights, the noise, the constant barrage of new faces and languages, it was overwhelming, to say the least. For Jira and his people, every aspect of modern life was a novel, often intimidating experience. The government and various cultural preservation organizations stepped in, offering support and resources to facilitate their integration. Researchers worked closely with Jira and his people to learn more about their culture and background. It was later discovered that this group belongs to a previously unknown Aboriginal clan, which call themselves the Kalani. Jira, who had shown such strength and resilience in the face of the Bunyip, now found himself in a position he could never have prepared for. Despite the overwhelming challenges, Jira faced this new world with the same bravery he had shown in the wilderness. He took charge, helping his people to navigate the complexities of this new life with a quiet dignity. I did everything in my power to bridge the gap between his world and ours. I worked with the support teams. I spent hours with Jira and the others, listening to their concerns, their fears, and their hopes. In the aftermath of the incident, Karijini National Park became the center of a highly clandestine operation. A task force from the Australian Defence Force was deployed, and the park was promptly locked down. Their mission was shrouded in secrecy, and the park remained off limits to the public for an extended period. During this time, I was subjected to a series of extensive interviews. The authorities were particularly interested in every detail of my encounter with the Bunyip, how Jira and I managed to survive, and ultimately how we defeated it. I wasn't privy to the details of their operation or what they discovered in the depths of the park. There were whispers and rumors. Of course, talk of strange findings, mysterious artifacts, and entities other than the Bunyip. But nothing was confirmed publicly. Eventually, the park was deemed safe and the restrictions were lifted. Returning to my duties as a park ranger after the events in the park is like stepping into a familiar painting that has had its colors subtly altered. There's an unspoken understanding among the rangers. We tread more carefully, speak more softly, and listen more intently to the whispers of the outback. There's a respect, a reverence almost, for what may still lie hidden in its depths. This happened over 8 years ago, yet it still clings to my mind as if it all happened yesterday. The memory is sharp, fresh, and I can feel the weight of it in my chest, especially when I close my eyes. Edward, our dear friend, passed away in a horrible accident. No matter what they say, no matter how they try to comfort me, deep down, I know it's my fault. We had planned the hike long before he died. Back then, everything seemed normal. The woods in Norway were supposed to be an escape, a place to clear our minds and reset. But after Edward's death, it became something else entirely. We weren't going to the woods for an adventure anymore. We were going to honor him, to somehow pay tribute to his absence. I still remember the conversation I had with him. We were sitting at a small cafe in the heart of the city, sipping our drinks after a long day of catching up. Edward had just returned from England, and as usual, his energy was infectious. He'd been telling me about his work, his life in the UK, but now his tone shifted to something more serious, a kind of excitement that only he could summon. "There's something beautiful," he said, leaning in a little closer, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark. "Something the world hasn't seen before. I raised an eyebrow, half smiling at him. What are you talking about, man? What's so special? Edward's grin widened. There's a place out there in the woods. I can't describe it, but I know it's exactly what we need. You, me, the guys. We're going to see it. We ought to see it. I stared at him for a moment, trying to process what he meant. Edward was always full of ideas, most of them crazy, but this felt different, like there was something in his words that pulled at me. He wasn't joking, I could tell. This was serious for him. Are you sure? I asked, my voice low, still unsure. We've all got our own stuff going on, Ed. You really think this is the time for something like that? Edward leaned back in his chair, looking at me with a kind of conviction I hadn't seen in him before. You've been carrying that weight, Ethan. And so have I. We need this. Something pure, something untouched. The woods. The quarry. It'll clear our heads, I promise you. I thought about it for a moment, the weight of my own life pressing on me. The divorce, the loneliness, the mess I was constantly cleaning up. Maybe Edward was right. Maybe this trip, this strange place he was talking about, was exactly what we needed. I don't know, man, I said, feeling the pull of his enthusiasm. It just sounds too good to be true. The world doesn't work like that, you know. Edward chuckled, his eyes softening. I know. But sometimes, you've got to go after the impossible to find something real. I looked at him, and for a brief moment, I saw that old Edward again. The one who believed in things, who saw beauty in the world even when everything around him seemed dark. It was contagious. All right? I said finally, shaking my head but smiling. I'm in. But if this turns into some wild goose chase, I'm blaming you. Edward laughed, the sound filling the space between us. Trust me, Ethan. This isn't a chase. It's something you'll never forget. There was 5 of us who planned the entire trip, but then the accident happened and there was only the 4 of us. Francis, Joshua, Peter, and me, Ethan. But it never felt like 4. Edward's memory weighed on me the heaviest. He had been a good man, the kind of person you hold on to in a world like this. Honest, down to earth, with a smile that made you believe there was something good left in the world. Now he was gone, and we were left with nothing but the burden of his absence. Joshua was the first to suggest we still go. A solid guy, physically, but not much else. Joshua had always carried some weight, not from age but from bad habits. It showed in his broad frame, his tired eyes, and the heavy way he moved. His life was a mess, though he never talked about it. He had a wife and 2 kids at home, yet we all knew where he spent his nights. Seedy places, strip clubs, hotels, anywhere he could run away from the truth. His personal demons followed him everywhere. But the real problem wasn't just his inability to face his own flaws. No, it was me. I wasn't the cause of his problems, but I was the one who took the brunt of his anger. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the quiet disdain. He blamed me for everything, for Rob's death, for the way his life had spiraled, even for his failing marriage. It was hard to be around Joshua after Edward died. He was an emotional wreck, only masking it behind tough talk and ill-advised actions. His temper was always on the edge, and when I'd catch him staring at me with those bloodshot eyes, I knew the anger simmering inside him was meant for me. Francis was the religious one. He was the kind of guy who believed everything happened for a reason, that there was a divine purpose behind it all. Edward's death, part of God's plan, Francis would say. I hated hearing that. What kind of plan takes a good man away from his friends and family? What kind of God allows something like that to happen? Despite my frustrations, Francis's faith never wavered. It was unshakable. His prayers before every meal, his insistence on forgiveness. It grated on me. Sometimes I'd bite my tongue, but other times I'd mutter under my breath, "Some plan." It wasn't just the tragedy that upset me. It was his way of coping with it, as if the pain could be prayed away. as if Edward's life was some sacrifice for a greater good. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted Edward back. I wanted answers. I didn't know whether to admire Francis for his conviction or resent him for it. He seemed to have it all together, with his steadfast faith and unwavering optimism. But deep down, I knew it was a mask. No one can truly be that certain, and that bothered me more than I cared to admit. Peter, though, was the one I envied the most. The perfect life, married to a stunning wife, with 2 little girls who adored him. He had it all. The career, the family, the happiness. On the outside, Peter was everything I wasn't. Stable, loved, respected. He was the kind of man you wanted to hate, but couldn't, because he was just too damn kind. He never pushed me to open up about my failures or my struggles. He never judged me for the mess I was. Instead, Peter looked after me quietly, in his own subtle way. When I was at my lowest, he'd take me aside and tell me everything would be okay, even when I didn't believe him. There was something comforting about Peter, though it made me feel small, insignificant. His kindness felt like a reminder of how far I had fallen. I guess that's what made it harder when things went wrong. Peter deserved better. He didn't deserve to be caught up in this mess. Me. And then there was me. The screw-up. The one who couldn't hold a relationship together, who wasted every opportunity in life through his way. I was a mess. Drugs, failed jobs, broken friendships. I was everything Joshua hated, everything Francis prayed for, and everything Peter pitied. I was the outsider in our group, the one who was never quite on the same wavelength as the others. The one who never quite belonged. I wasn't close to Edward like the others had been, but I admired him. He was everything I wasn't: confident, composed, and self-assured. He had his life figured out. I never did. So when he died, it shattered something in me, and I've never been able to piece it back together. We climbed toward the creek that ran through the mountain, talking about Edward as we ascended. His laugh, his quirks, the way he would have loved this trip. It was supposed to feel good, to honor him. But instead it felt wrong, like we were forcing something that didn't belong anymore. We weren't a group of friends anymore. We were just strangers to each other, trying to outrun the pain, the guilt. When we reached the summit, other hikers were already there. Families with picnics, children playing by the water. It all felt so out of place. This wasn't a place for joy. Not now. Not without Edward. I kept looking over my shoulder, as if expecting him to be there with us, his laugh ringing through the air. But he wasn't, only an empty presence that filled the hollow ground. We climbed toward the creek that ran through the mountain, our steps heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. The higher we ascended, the more I felt the absence of Edward, like a shadow cast long behind us. We spoke of him, his laugh, his quirks, the way he would have loved this trip. Every memory was supposed to honor him, to keep him alive in some small way. But instead, it felt like we were forcing something that didn't belong anymore. The trail narrowed as we approached the summit, and when we finally reached the top, the sight that greeted us made my stomach twist. The landscape should have been a reminder of peace, of the solace we sought, but instead it felt foreign. The summit was crowded with families, mothers and fathers setting up picnics, children playing by the water, their laughter ringing in the crisp mountain air. It was too perfect, too much like something from a postcard, and I hated it. This wasn't a place for joy. Not now. Not without Edward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting him to materialize behind me, his familiar voice calling out my name, that laugh of his carrying through the trees. But he wasn't there. There was nothing but the emptiness left behind, the hollow ground that seemed to suck the life out of everything around it. "Let's sit for a bit," Peter said, pulling his backpack off and setting it down with a sigh. He looked at me, a faint smile on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Take in the view." I nodded, but I didn't sit. I couldn't. The air felt too thick, too heavy with the things unsaid. Instead, I walked over to the edge of the cliff, my eyes fixed on the horizon, trying to breathe through the knot in my chest. I lit up a cigarette, puffing through the heavy chemical smoke. Joshua approached after a few moments, walking up beside me. We stood there together, silent. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, his breath coming out in uneven bursts. I could feel the tension in him, the quiet anger that had been simmering since we first set foot on this trail. "You think he'd want us here?" Joshua muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer immediately. The question wasn't one I could easily answer. Did Edward really want this? Did he want us to carry on, to keep pushing through, when it felt like we were only dragging his memory along with us like a broken wheel? "He would," I finally said, my voice rough. "Edward wanted us to move forward." Joshua's head jerked slightly, but he didn't say anything else. Instead, he turned his gaze to the families below, the happy chatter of children climbing over rocks and chasing each other. His lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes stayed on them, like he was seeing something I couldn't. After a long pause, he spoke again, his tone harder. "Doesn't feel like we're doing much moving forward, does it?" I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't just that we were grieving, it was that we were still lost. Lost without Edward, and maybe even lost without each other. The idea of moving forward felt like a joke, like we were trying to take steps in a direction that didn't exist anymore. Finally, Francis called out from behind us, snapping me out of the quiet storm swirling in my mind. "Simon, let's keep going." We started back down the trail, moving in a somber procession toward the next part of the hike. I kept walking, my eyes on the ground, lost in thought, until I heard Peter call out from a little ahead. "Hold up. You guys need to see this." We all quickened our pace, curiosity mingling with a growing sense of dread. Peter was standing just off the path, his face pale and drawn. He motioned toward the forest that lay just beyond the trail. "What is it?" I asked, stepping forward to see. There, hanging in the trees like some sick joke, was the body of a gutted elk. Its carcass was suspended, the blood still fresh, dripping from the open wound. But it wasn't just the brutal nature of the kill that stopped me in my tracks. It was the symbols, carved deep into the bark of the surrounding trees. Strange, angular marks that seemed to pulse with some kind of malevolent energy. "What the hell is this?" Francis breathed, his voice low and shaken. "That's fucking witchcraft," said Peter with a bit of tension in his voice. "We should turn back," Joshua muttered, his face ashen. "This isn't right." But Peter stepped forward, squinting at the symbols on the trees. "No, wait," he said, a hint of stubbornness in his voice. "There's a shortcut around here. If we cut through the forest, we can avoid this mess and get to the next camp faster." I looked at him, then back at the grotesque scene before us. My stomach churned, but something in me snapped. "No," I said, my voice cold. "We're not going into that forest. Not after this." Francis, standing off to the side, clenched his jaw, his eyes flicking between us. "We don't even know what we're looking at. It's just some weird hunting ritual. A warning, maybe. Or something worse," Joshua said, his voice tight. His gaze never left the elk's body. There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought I saw the fear in Joshua's eyes, something deeper than the anger he usually wore like armor. "We need to stick together," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "Whatever this is, we're better off facing it as a group." We turned back, go back to the marked trail. Now, but no one moved. Instead, Peter's voice broke through, low and stubborn. "We're cutting through. On our trail." Darkness fell upon us. It must have been 3 or 4 hours that we were circling onwards through the way. A path Peter had suggested that would be quick. Eventually night fell and the clouds thundered with heavy roars. Eventually, we stumbled upon an empty cabin in the woods. The rain came down harder, than hard and had all evenings. The sound of it pummeling the roof of the cabin felt like an endless drumbeat, drowning out everything else. The fire in the small stone hearth flickered weakly, casting warped shadows across the walls. We were all huddled inside, wet, cold, and restless. The storm outside seemed endless, and the darkness inside felt suffocating. We had no choice but to take shelter here. The cabin, though old and decayed, offered us some protection from the torrential downpour. We could have kept going, tried to push through, but the forest had swallowed us whole, and none of us had the energy or the desire to venture back into it. Not tonight. Shit. Joshua muttered under his breath as he rubbed his hands together for warmth. This place gives me the creeps. I think we should have just kept moving. I agreed. The cabin was unsettling. The air felt thick with something I couldn't put my finger on, but it wasn't just the storm. It was something in the very bones of this place. The wooden beams creaked, and the floorboards groaned as if the building itself was alive, holding its breath. And then we found it. Tucked into the far corner of the room, behind an old moth-eaten curtain, lay an effigy. The decapitated torso of a man. No, not a man. Of something human, but not entirely. It was made of twigs, carefully crafted with a sickening precision. Antlers jutted out from the shoulders where arms should have been, each limb unnaturally bent. At its feet lay necklaces strung with more symbols, twisted, grotesque markings that seemed to pulse with something dark. The whole scene made my stomach churn. Jesus Christ, Francis whispered, his voice barely audible. What the fuck is this? We all stood there, frozen for a moment. The air felt thick with unease, and no one dared approach the effigy. But there was nowhere else to go. So, we did what we had to do. We made camp in the same room, trying to block out the strange presence of the twisted figure. That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm raged outside, and the cabin creaked with every gust of wind. But it wasn't just the storm that kept me awake. It was the memory. The accident. I kept hearing the crash in my head, the sound of metal twisting, crunching against metal, and then the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. The screeching of the tires, the engine's roar as it swerved out of control, everything happening in slow motion. I could see it over and over again. Edward standing there, frozen, unable to move, his eyes wide with shock as the truck careened toward him. I could have saved him. I woke up with a gasp, my body soaked in cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached up instinctively to touch my own face, as if to remind myself I was still here, still alive. But the nightmare lingered. The guilt. The failure. It would always be with me. My chest burned, and I winced as I touched it. Something was wrong. I pulled back my shirt to reveal the source of the pain. Puncture wounds, several of them, chevlo holes, scattered across my chest. Blood was dried in places, but the wounds were still fresh. The others were beginning to stir, groaning and stretching in their places, unaware of the horrors that had already begun to settle in. And then I heard it. Peter screamed, his voice high, pitched with terror. And I turned to find him writhing on the floor, his eyes wide with fear, his body trembling uncontrollably. He was soaked through, his clothes plastered to his skin, as if he had just been dragged through the mud. But it wasn't the rain that made him like this. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "Help me," Peter cried out. "It's coming. It's coming." I rushed to him, trying to calm him down, but Peter wasn't hearing it. His breath was ragged, his eyes unfocused, and the stench of urine filled the air. I could barely look at him. Then I saw Joshua. He was sitting in a corner, his eyes wide, but not seeing anything. His lips moved in a continuous chant, his body stiff as though he were caught in some kind of trance. He was screaming now, too. But it wasn't the scream of a man in pain. It was the scream of a man calling for something, someone. Abigail, his wife. The name echoed through the cabin, twisted and haunting. But it was Francis that made me freeze in place. I turned to see him, standing in front of the effigy, completely naked. His hands were raised in prayer, his face a mask of anguish. "Please forgive me," he murmured, his voice cracking. "Please, God, forgive me. What the fuck is going on?" Peter shouted, panic creeping into his voice. I couldn't answer. All I knew was that something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just fear. This wasn't just a bad dream. Whatever was happening to us was tied to this place, to the forest, and to the damn effigy. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "No. We can't stay here any longer." But I wasn't in charge. Francis, shaking with feverish desperation, was the first to make a move toward the door. "We need to leave. This place is cursed," he muttered, but his words sounded like something else. A command, a warning. We stumbled outside, trying to get our bearings in the forest. The trees loomed over us, silent sentinels in the gray light of morning. Francis led the way, his gaze fixed, almost hypnotically, on the path ahead. But I could see it in his eyes. He was as lost as we were. And then it happened. "Over there," Francis whispered, his voice hoarse. "Do you see that?" We all turned to look. There, amidst the trees, a large figure, tall, dark, and looming, shifted between the branches. I saw it first, and my heart skipped a beat. It was massive, its silhouette so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. "Stop," I ordered, my voice hard. "You're seeing things." But Francis wasn't backing down. "No, I saw it," he insisted. "It's out there. We need to run." But Peter, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "There's nothing out there. Just trees." That's when Joshua snapped. "We wouldn't even be here if it weren't for him," he shouted, pointing directly at me. "This is all your fault, Ethan." And my blood ran cold, and I felt the sting of his accusation. We wouldn't be here if you hadn't dragged us into this mess." I shot back, the words bitter in my throat. "We wouldn't be in these woods at all if you hadn't insisted on coming. If you hadn't pushed us." The tension snapped. Joshua lunged at me, fists flying. I barely dodged, stumbling backward as his rage consumed him. And in that moment, I knew. We were all broken. But it was too late. The forest was never going to let us leave. It was only the beginning. As we continued up the narrow trail, the atmosphere shifted. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees towering high and blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and moss, a heaviness that pressed against my chest. We were pushing through the underbrush, talking less now. "Do you think we're close?" I asked, glancing back at Edward. "I hope so," Edward replied, wiping sweat from his brow, his voice strained. "But I've got a bad feeling about this. Something doesn't feel right." "Ethan." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my name in Edward's voice echoed in my mind, as if he were standing right next to me. My senses sharpened, a sudden clarity hitting me like a jolt of electricity. I turned, expecting to see him there, but the space around me was empty. But when I looked at the others, their eyes were wide, their faces twisted in confusion. "Ethan." Peter's voice broke through the haze in my mind, sharp and clear. "Who are you talking to?" I blinked rapidly, the fog in my brain slowly lifting. "He's right here," I whispered, glancing around the campsite, my breath quickening. But the three of them just stared at me, eyes narrowed with concern. "Are you hallucinating?" Peter asked, his tone low, skeptical. He stepped closer, as if worried I might lose touch with reality altogether. I shook my head, a feeling of disorientation creeping through me. No. He was here. I swear it. I heard him." They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to laugh it off or pull me aside for some kind of intervention. "You're not making sense, Ethan," Peter said, his voice thick with a mix of confusion and concern. "There's no one else here but us. You need to get it together." I could feel the heat rising in my face, the embarrassment sinking in. It wasn't like me to lose it, not like this. I wasn't the guy to break down. But what I had felt, what I had heard was real. Edward was there. I knew it. Maybe we're just all losing it, I said, my voice shaky. Come on. Peter's voice broke me from my slumber, his voice gruff as usual. We're just a few miles off the trail. We'll find something, maybe a lodge or a ranger station. Don't get spooked. I wasn't spooked, at least not in the way Peter thought, but something gnawed at me. A persistent feeling that we were headed in the wrong direction. Still, I pushed it down. We were here for Edward, for this damn trip that was supposed to help us move on, not dwell on fears. The sudden sight of the abandoned tent was what snapped me back into reality. I stopped dead in my tracks, my boots crunching on the underbrush as I caught sight of the worn, partially collapsed structure half hidden in the foliage. The canvas was tattered, its frame leaning crookedly against a tree like it had been left in a hurry. What the hell? Joshua muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he moved closer. Someone was here recently, Peter said, stepping up with his usual optimism. Probably a hiker. They must have camped here and moved on. Nothing to worry about. I wasn't so sure. I approached cautiously, my instincts telling me to be wary. There was an eerie stillness in the air, an unnatural quiet that made my skin crawl. As I got closer, I saw the backpack half buried under leaves, a wallet resting just beneath it. I reached down and pulled it out. It's expired, I said, holding up the wallet, the card inside reading 1984. That sent a shiver down my spine. There was no way anyone could have hiked out here with something from 4 decades ago. Okay, that's odd, Francis muttered, looking over my shoulder. Let's just keep moving. We don't have time to. No, I interrupted, my voice firm. This is a bad sign. We need to turn back. Peter shook his head, frowning. Can't. We're too far in. If we turn back now, we'll waste even more time. Peter just shrugged. We're close. You'll see. Let's set up camp here. It's the best spot we've come across. Against my better judgment, we made camp. The darkness of the forest seemed to press in closer as night fell, the air cooler now, and the weight of the silence was suffocating. It felt wrong, but Peter was right about one thing: we had nowhere else to go. The tension in the group was palpable as we sat around the fire, trying to ignore the knowing sense of dread settling into our bones. Later that night, I was woken by Peter's scream. The sound ripped through the quiet of the night like a knife, followed by a series of heavy footsteps. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through me as I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, eyes wide in the darkness. Peter, I shouted, scrambling to my feet. I could hear him now, panicked breathing and muffled shouts coming from the direction of his tent. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside, the others following close behind. We found the tent collapsed, half torn apart, but there was no sign of Peter. Panic gripped me as I searched the area, the beam of the flashlight flickering over the forest floor, but there was no trace of him. Veer the fuck is he? I muttered, my voice thick with fear. We split up to search, calling his name, but there was nothing. It felt like the forest had swallowed him whole. By dawn, we realized we were lost. The trail had disappeared completely. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and thick undergrowth, and our supplies were running low. The evening crept in, the sun dipping below the horizon. As we were moving through the forest, trying to find any sign of civilization, Peter's scream echoed in the night again. But this time, it was different. There was a brutal urgency to it, a terror that sent us running towards him. I didn't make it in time. We had found Peter, or what remained of him. His body was impaled on tree branches, mutilated beyond recognition. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. We barely had time to mourn before we had to bury him. An impromptu, desperate ceremony that didn't feel real. It felt like we were in a nightmare, and I kept hoping I'd wake up. But I didn't. Francis had disappeared next. 1 minute he was there, clutching his rosary, mumbling about God's plan, and the next he was just gone. No sounds, no signs, nothing but an empty space where he should have been. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Joshua was beside himself, pacing in frantic circles, muttering incoherent words under his breath. His face was pale, his eyes wild with terror, darting from shadow to shadow as if he expected something to jump out and grab him. He was trembling, on the verge of breaking completely. What do we do, Ethan?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with panic. He looked at me as if I held some answer, as if I could pull us out of this nightmare. But I had nothing to give him, no reassurance, no plan. I was as lost as he was. I tried to keep my voice steady to at least pretend I was calm. "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here. We'll find a way out." But deep down, I didn't believe it. The forest had become an endless maze, each path winding into another, each turn leading us deeper into a twisted labyrinth with no escape. The trees loomed over us, their branches twisted into gnarled fingers, clawing at the sky. And there was something else in the air. A strange, oppressive silence that weighed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every so often, I'd call out Francis's name, hoping for a response. But there was only silence, broken occasionally by the sounds of Joshua's strangled cries. "To Joshua," I said, trying to pull him out of his panic. "Look at me. We need to stay calm, okay? We have to keep our heads clear." He looked at me, his face twisted in fear. "Stay calm. Ethan, Peter's dead. Francis is gone. We're alone out here. We're not getting out of here. Are we?" I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we'd make it back, but the words died on my tongue. I couldn't lie, not when the truth was so painfully clear. I forced myself to look away from his desperate, searching eyes, focusing on the ground beneath me. I had to keep moving. I had to keep trying, if only for a shred of hope. We walked in silence for hours, though it felt like days. The sun had long disappeared behind a blanket of thick clouds, casting the forest in a gray, eerie twilight that seemed to stretch on forever. Shadows crept along the ground, stretching toward us like dark tendrils, and the forest seemed to come alive around us. Every rustle, every crackle of leaves felt like a threat. Then, just when I thought Joshua had calmed down, he stopped dead in his tracks and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, there was only silence, but then, there it was, a faint whisper, a soft, almost melodic sound, like someone singing far off in the distance. The sound was haunting, echoing through the trees, drawing us in. It's Francis." Joshua breathed, his eyes wide. He turned to me, a desperate glimmer of hope in his gaze. "He's calling for us." "Joshua, wait." I started, but he was already moving, his feet carrying him toward the sound, deeper into the shadows. I wanted to stop him, to pull him back, but a part of me wondered. What if he was right? What if it was Francis? What if we'd finally found one of our friends? I followed him, the both of us moving quickly, almost running now, chasing that faint voice that danced on the edges of our hearing. The forest closed in around us, branches scratching at our faces and arms as we pushed forward. But as we got closer, the voice changed. It grew distorted, the melody twisting into something darker, something that sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed Joshua's shoulder, yanking him back. "Listen," I hissed. "Does that sound like Francis to you?" Joshua stopped, his face going pale. The voice was no longer gentle or familiar. It was hollow, inhuman, echoing with a sinister undertone. It felt like the forest itself was mocking us, mimicking the sound of our friend luring us in. We stood there, frozen, the realization hitting us like a punch. This isn't right," Joshua muttered, his voice shaking. "Ethan, we need to get out of here. Now." But as we turned to leave, The shadows seemed to close in tighter around us, blocking our path, trapping us. And that voice, that twisted, haunting melody, was getting louder, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. The path ahead stretched out bare and hauntingly still, as if the forest itself had drawn away, opening up a desolate, naked path. Joshua was nowhere to be seen. I'd lost him, or he'd slipped away without a sound. The silence clung to me, an oppressive void that only deepened the terror sinking into my bones. For days I walked, feeling the minutes stretch into hours, hours into an eternity. Hunger clawed at me, and thirst gnawed at my throat, but there was no turning back, no retracing my steps. I could hear them sometimes. Peter's faint voice, calling my name as if from a distance, an echo. Francis's laugh would break the silence, eerie and strange, like it was bouncing off the trees. And Joshua. I thought I'd hear him muttering in the shadows, but when I looked, there was nothing, just the dead, empty silence. Were they alive, waiting for me to find them? Or were they gone, and I was next? The questions festered in my mind, gnawing at my sanity. I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the whispers, the sounds that lingered on the edge of my hearing like a constant taunt. Then, at last, I saw it, a faint glimmer in the distance, like a tiny beacon piercing through the trees. A cottage, half hidden in the shadowy forest, with a light flickering in its window. My heart surged with hope. I ran, stumbling, fighting the branches that clawed at my arms, urging my legs to move faster. This was it. My way out. I could feel it in my bones, that primal instinct to survive pushing me forward, guiding me toward salvation. But just as I was about to reach the edge of the forest, something stopped me in my tracks. A sound, chilling and unmistakable. Screams, piercing the air. Cries filled with a haunting agony. I froze, and slowly, my gaze drifted back toward the darkness behind me. They were there, Peter, Francis, and Joshua, standing in the shadows, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. Blood dripped from their lips, their eyes wide and empty, bodies mangled and torn. Peter's arm dangled uselessly by his side, his shirt stained with dark, drying blood. Francis had a gaping wound across his throat, raw and gory, yet he smiled with a chilling calmness. Joshua stood closest, his face frozen in a mask of pain and mirth. Skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, his mouth twisted in an unnatural grin. They raised their hands, waving at me like they were bidding me farewell, that eerie smile lingering on each of their bloodied faces. Their mouths opened, and their voices drifted out in a chorus of tortured farewells, whispering my name in a macabre melody that made my blood run cold. I turned away, my heart pounding, and I ran, pushing myself past the edge of exhaustion, past the limits of fear. I burst out onto the open path, stumbling into the faint light that lay ahead, desperate for escape, for help, for anything that wasn't the nightmare I'd left behind. As I sprinted, their voices chased after me, distorted and warped, mingling with the distant laughter of the forest. But I kept running, not daring to look back. I eventually reached civilization. I tried to tell them what had happened, but no one believed me. They told me it was only a freak accident. The park rangers never sent a search party out. They closed my case and deemed me insane. But I'm not insane, right? I can still hear them calling out my name. I can't sleep anymore. I must go back to the woods. I must save Francis and Joshua. I see Edward. I have him with alive. Still, he's alive. This day, they don't think I will be able to be a function of these woods, and I'm a foos. I don't want to try everything. Wish me lovery. I don't want anyone try to follow in our footsteps. We were full sharing, so they don't think they'll okay as well. This will be my last post. The day I stumbled on that box of old photos hidden under a loose floorboard. I figured it was just some junk, some old ranger's forgotten keepsakes. But now, sitting here with only the wind howling outside and the snow piling up against the cabin, I wish I'd left that damn box alone. When I signed up for the winter shift at the ranger station, I was looking for solitude. That's why I took the job, a paycheck for a few months of peace, a chance to reset after a rough year. The idea of being cut off from the world wasn't scary. It was a relief. The station was way out there, perched on the edge of a snowy wilderness where no one went unless they absolutely had to. My duties were simple: monitor the weather, check for avalanche risks, and report weekly to the central office via the crackly old radio in the main room. The isolation hit me on the drive in. The nearest town was a 3-hour slog down an icy road that twisted through mountains and thick forest. By the time I got to the station, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The place itself was nothing fancy: a squat wooden cabin with a steep roof and a chimney that puffed smoke like an old man out of breath. Inside it was warm but basic: a main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, a small bedroom, and a storage area crammed with supplies and tools. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time settling in and finding ways to kill the boredom. I split logs for the stove, explored the surrounding woods on snowshoes, and made some half-assed attempts to sketch the mountains on a notepad I'd brought. Nights were long and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like the world is holding its breath. It was on the 4th day that I found the box. I was cleaning out the storage area, organizing cans of food and coiling ropes, when my foot caught on a raised floorboard. Curious, I pried it up with a crowbar and found a small wooden box, its surface scuffed and worn. Inside were photographs, old black and white prints with curled edges. Most were harmless enough shots of the ranger station in different seasons. A man, probably the ranger before me, let's call him Bill, posing with a cheerful smile in front of the cabin, his dog, a German shepherd named Max, sitting at his feet. But as I shuffled through the stack, the vibe changed. Bill's smile faded in later pictures, replaced by a look of unease. One image stuck out. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the tree line, his back to the camera. Then there were the nighttime shots. These were grainy and poorly lit, taken from inside the cabin. They showed dark shapes standing among the trees, always at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the cabin's exterior light. In one, the figure seemed closer, a blurred shadow leaning slightly toward the camera, like it knew it was being watched. A chill crawled up my spine as I flipped through them. Why would someone take photos like these? And why hide them? I shoved the photos back in the box and replaced the floorboard, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It was probably just paranoia, I told myself. Old rangers with too much time on their hands, playing tricks on themselves. But that night, as I sat by the stove, the wind seemed to push harder against the cabin, and the shadows cast by the firelight stretched long and weird across the walls. The next morning, I woke up to find something strange. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the clearing in an undisturbed layer of white. As I brewed my coffee, I glanced out the window and froze. Just beyond the edge of the cabin's porch, there were footprints. They started near the tree line and stopped a few feet from the door, like someone had stood there, staring at the cabin. I threw on my coat and boots and stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. The prints were large, the kind left by heavy boots, and spaced too evenly to be animal tracks. I followed them to where they ended abruptly, the snow pristine beyond the last imprint. There was no sign of anyone leaving, no clue where they'd gone. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling exposed in the wide, open clearing. My breath fogged in front of me, and every sound seemed amplified: the crunch of snow under my boots, the faint groan of branches in the wind. When I stepped back inside, I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't bothered to do before. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on my duties, but the thought of those tracks nagged at me. By evening, as the light faded and the cabin was swallowed by the early winter darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I heard the first sound. It came just after midnight, a faint tapping on the window. I froze in bed, straining to listen. The sound came again, soft and irregular, like fingers brushing against the glass. My heart hammered as I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark as I aimed it toward the window. Nothing. The tapping stopped as soon as the light hit the glass. I stared for a long moment, waiting for something to move, but the window only showed the swirling snow and the dim outline of the trees beyond. I didn't sleep well after that. Over the next few days, the disturbances kept happening. I found more footprints near the cabin, though always spaced far enough apart to make it impossible to track where they led. Tools I'd left in the storage area were moved, never stolen, just subtly rearranged. A can of soup I'd put on the counter disappeared, only to reappear in the storage closet the next morning. I started to suspect someone was trying to unnerve me, to make me abandon the station. Maybe hunters or locals who resented the ranger presence. Or maybe something worse. The final straw came on the 7th night. I'd been sitting by the stove, trying to lose myself in a book, when I heard a faint creak. It was the floorboard in the hallway. I froze, every muscle tense, as the sound came again, a deliberate step just outside the room I was in. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I waited, the seconds stretching into minutes until the sound stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to check it out, the hallway was empty, and the cabin was as silent as ever. But something was different. One of the photographs had been placed on the kitchen table. It showed the cabin at night, the silhouette of a figure standing just outside the window. The morning after finding that photograph on the kitchen table, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been restless, filled with the sound of tapping on glass and shadows darting just out of sight. That photo, the one of the figure standing outside the cabin at night, was burned into my mind. I hadn't moved it from the table. Somehow, the thought of touching it felt like acknowledging its presence, giving it power, and I wasn't ready for that. The cabin was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the walls as the wind pushed against them. I forced myself to go through the motions of my morning routine, lighting the stove, brewing coffee, jotting down notes about the weather. It was a ritual I clung to, a tether to normalcy in a place that was starting to feel anything but normal. It wasn't long before I noticed the first sign that something was off. Stepping outside to gather firewood, I found fresh footprints in the snow again. These were closer than the ones I'd seen a few days ago, leading from the tree line directly to the side of the cabin. The tracks stopped right below my bedroom window. My chest tightened as I stared at them, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. Who would come this far, in these conditions, just to circle the cabin? Why wouldn't they knock or announce themselves? The logical part of my brain whispered excuses. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, or some hiker who'd gotten lost. But I knew better. There was no reason anyone should be this far out, especially not in the dead of winter. And the fact that they didn't leave a trail leading away from the cabin, that was harder to explain. I circled the cabin, searching for any sign of tampering. The windows were still shut, and the door was locked, just as I'd left it the night before. Yet, something felt off. It was a subtle thing, the kind of feeling you quite put your finger on but can't ignore either, like the static hum of a distant radio station you're not tuned into. Back inside, I decided to look for answers. If Bill had left those photographs behind, maybe there were other clues, a logbook, notes, anything to explain what had been happening here before I arrived. The station's logs were kept in a weathered binder tucked into a cabinet, near the radio. Most of the entries were mundane notes about snowfall, temperature, sightings of wildlife. But as I flipped through, I started noticing something strange. The last few weeks of entries from Bill were fragmented, scattered with incomplete thoughts and abrupt stops. One line stood out, scrawled hastily across the bottom of a page. They come at night. New details, no explanation. Just those 4 words. Further back, I found a note that mentioned hearing sounds outside the cabin but dismissed them as wind. Another entry, dated a few days later, mentioned footprints in the snow, too large to belong to an animal. The final entry, dated several weeks before my arrival, was shorter than the others. I'm not alone. And that was it. No record of Bill leaving, no official closing statement about the station, just silence. I shut the binder and leaned back in the chair, staring at the radio on the desk. The idea of calling the central office crossed my mind, but I knew the signal out here was unreliable at best. It would take a miracle to get through, and even if I did, what would I say? That I was spooked by some footprints and old photos. They'd laugh me off the line. By midday, I decided to set a few traps, not for hunting, but for information. If someone was entering the cabin while I slept, I needed proof. I balanced a pencil on the windowsill, its placement precise enough that even the slightest nudge would make it fall. In the kitchen, I sprinkled a thin line of flour near the door to catch footprints. I even left a crumb of bread just inside the storage area, a subtle marker that no one would disturb unless they were snooping around. That night, I double-checked every lock and barricaded the door with a chair before heading to bed. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin like an angry spirit. My flashlight stayed within arm's reach, and I slept with one ear open, straining to catch any sound beyond the storm. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint, rhythmic noise, the gentle rattle of the doorknob. My pulse quickened as I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Someone or something was testing the lock. I reached for the flashlight and hesitated. Part of me wanted to fling the door open, confront whoever was outside. The other part, the one ruled by instinct, told me to stay quiet, to listen and wait. The rattling stopped abruptly, replaced by the creak of footsteps retreating into the snow. When the silence returned, I forced myself to check the traps. The pencil on the windowsill was gone, lying on the floor beneath the window. In the kitchen, the flour had been disturbed, a single footprint smudging the line I'd left near the door. My throat tightened as I examined it. The print was large, boot-shaped, and pointed toward the inside of the cabin. Someone had been in here. The next morning, the air felt heavier, as though the cabin itself had absorbed the tension from the night before. I forced myself to go outside, to clear my head and survey the area. The footprints were there again, faint but visible, leading toward the tree line and disappearing into the forest. I thought about following them, but the idea of venturing into the woods alone, without knowing what or who I was dealing with, felt reckless. Instead, I decided to study the photographs more closely. I pried up the floorboard and retrieved the box, spreading the pictures out on the kitchen table under the weak winter sunlight. There were more details I hadn't noticed before. In one photo, a dark shape, barely visible behind the cabin. In another, what looked like a figure holding something, a bag, a crate. It was too blurry to tell, but the sense of unease it gave me was sharp and immediate. Then I noticed something chilling. In one of the final photos, the camera's perspective had changed. It wasn't taken from the cabin looking out, it was taken from the tree line, looking in. Bill, the ranger from the earlier photos, was visible through the window, sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. My stomach dropped. Someone had been watching him, just as someone was watching me now. Flipping the photo over, I noticed faint pencil marks on the back. The writing was nearly illegible, faded over time, but I could make out two words, hidden stash. My pulse quickened. Hidden stash. Was this about contraband? Had Bill stumbled onto something he shouldn't have? It would explain a lot: the warnings, the surveillance, the silent intimidation. If this station was being used as a drop point for something illegal, my presence here was a threat to whoever was running the operation. But that didn't explain why they hadn't confronted me directly. Why the games? Why the warnings instead of outright violence? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play. If there was a stash, it had to be somewhere close. I spent the better part of the morning searching the cabin, combing through every drawer, every cabinet, every dusty corner of the storage area. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual supplies: canned food, ropes, first aid kits, and old tools. Frustrated, I decided to check outside. The snow was thick, crunching under my boots as I circled the cabin. I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting to the tree line where the footprints had appeared. If something was hidden out here, it would take time to find. I started with the most obvious places: beneath the porch, near the woodpile, but came up empty. Then, near the edge of the clearing, I noticed something odd: a section of ground where the snow had been disturbed, as if someone had dug there recently. The snow had refrozen into a crusty layer, but the marks were clear. I dropped to my knees and began digging with my hands, the icy snow biting into my skin. After a few minutes, my fingers scraped against something solid. I cleared away more snow and unearthed a small metal box, rusted and dented. My heart raced as I pried it open. Inside were several items: a bundle of faded photographs, a notebook, and a folded piece of cloth. The photographs were similar to the ones I'd already found, but these showed something different: people, strangers, standing in the clearing at night, their faces blurred and indistinct. The notebook was damp but still legible. Flipping through it, I found entries written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. They come at night, always watching. Don't trust the radio. Interference isn't natural. Found the stash, marked the spot, but they know I know. If you're reading this, leave while you still can. The last page held a crude map of the area around the station, with an X marked deep in the woods. I folded the map and tucked it into my jacket. Whatever this stash was, it was important enough for someone to guard it and to drive out anyone who got too close. Back inside, I stared at the radio. The notebook's warning rang in my head. Don't trust the radio. What did that mean? Interference wasn't uncommon out here, especially with the winter storms, but the idea that it wasn't natural unsettled me. I turned the dial, scanning for the familiar crackle of the central office's frequency. Static filled the cabin, sharp and grating. Then, faintly, a voice emerged. Leave now. Too late. Leave. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. The voice was distorted, broken by static, but unmistakable. Someone was broadcasting on the same frequency, and they weren't from the central office. Who is this? I said, my voice trembling. What do you want? The static swallowed the response, but I thought I heard laughter, low and mocking. Then the signal cut out entirely, leaving only silence. The map burned in my pocket. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. If the stash was what this was all about, finding might be my only way to understand what was happening and how to stop it. I packed a small bag with essentials: a flashlight, a knife, and the map. Before leaving, I set up another series of traps around the cabin. If someone tried to follow me, or worse, break in while I was gone, I wanted to know. The woods were eerily quiet as I crossed the clearing, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Following the map, I navigated through dense undergrowth and even terrain, my breath fogging in the frigid air. After what felt like an hour, I reached the marked spot. The area was unremarkable, just a cluster of trees and a patch of snow. But the map was clear. This was it. I began to dig, my hands numb from the cold. After several minutes, I uncovered a second box, larger than the first. This one was locked, the metal reinforced with heavy hinges. I glanced around, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but the woods remained still. Using the knife, I pried at the lock until it gave way. Inside was a stash of items that sent a chill down my spine: sealed bags of white powder, stacks of cash, and a small handgun. This wasn't just contraband, it was evidence of a major operation. Let's call the new character in charge of the operation Frank. I stuffed the gun and the cash into my bag, leaving the drugs behind. Whoever Frank was, he wasn't just trying to scare me, he was protecting his livelihood. And now I had leverage. By the time I got back to the station, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air was thick with the promise of snow. I was exhausted, but adrenaline kept me moving. If they came for me tonight, I wouldn't go down without a fight. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The traps were undisturbed, and the radio was silent. I bolted the door and sat at the table, laying the gun and cash in front of me. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a flicker of control. They might have the numbers, but now I had something they didn't expect: crew, a way to fight back. As the wind howled outside and the shadows deepened, I prepared for the longest night of my life. The wind clawed at the windows, shaking the thin glass as I stared at the handgun on the table. Its presence felt both a comfort and a threat, a silent promise that the night ahead would demand decisions I wasn't ready for. My fingers hovered over the cold metal, tracing its edges. As the realization sank in, tonight, I wouldn't just be defending the cabin, I'd be fighting for my life. I began by preparing the cabin. My traps earlier had proven effective in detecting movement, but tonight they needed to be more than alarms. I rigged the kitchen door with a makeshift barricade, using a heavy chair and a length of rope tied to an overturned table. The windows were next. I stacked firewood beneath each one, enough to block a person from easily slipping inside. The last trap was in the hallway, the same spot where I'd heard those deliberate steps just nights before. I rigged an empty tin can with a length of fishing line, stretching it taut across the floor. If anyone stepped on it, the resulting clatter would give me a split second to react. When I finished, the cabin felt claustrophobic, the small space now crowded with barriers and tension. I placed the gun within arm's reach on the kitchen table and turned off the lights, plunging the room into a dense, suffocating darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the stove embers, casting jagged shadows against the walls. I sat in the chair by the table, the cash from the stash still spread out before me. It was bait, a lure to see if they'd come for what they were clearly desperate to protect. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and heavy in the silence. The first sound came just after midnight, a faint crunching outside the cabin. At first I thought it was the wind, but the noise was too deliberate, too steady. Footsteps. My grip tightened around the gun as I strained to hear more, every muscle in my body on edge. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and methodical. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were assessing, looking for a way in. A shadow passed across the window nearest the kitchen. So fleeting I almost doubted I'd seen it. Then came the tapping. It wasn't on the window this time, it was on the wall, a slow rhythmic knock, like the beat of a metronome. I clenched my jaw, willing myself not to react. The tapping continued, moving around the cabin's perimeter. It wasn't random. It was calculated, probing for a weak point. I stayed frozen, my eyes locked on the table, my ears straining for any shift in the sound. And then, suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than the noise had been. I tightened my grip on the gun, my knuckles white. A crash shattered the quiet. The barricade at the kitchen door buckled as something heavy slammed against it. My trap held, but the sound of splintering wood told me it wouldn't for long. They were coming. I bolted from the table, grabbing the gun and the flashlight. My first instinct was to head for the hallway, to put distance between myself and the breaking door. I heard another crash, louder this time, followed by the sharp crack of wood splitting. They'd breached the door. The tin can trap clattered behind me as I fled down the hallway, the noise echoing like a gunshot in the enclosed space. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, trembling as my hand shook. I turned into the storage room and crouched behind a stack of crates, forcing my breaths to come shallow and quiet. Footsteps echoed in the main room, multiple pairs. My mind raced. There were at least 2 of them, possibly 3. Their movements were deliberate, almost casual, as if they knew they had the upper hand. "Check the table," a voice said, low and rough. It was the first time I'd heard them speak. My stomach tightened. Their calm tone was more terrifying than anger. It was the voice of someone in control. I peered through a crack in the crates, my flashlight off to avoid detection. One of them, a guy I'll call Carl, moved into view, silhouetted by the faint glow of the stove. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat and a ski mask that hid his face. His gloved hands rifled through the cash on the table, pocketing some of it before turning to the hallway. I knew I couldn't wait for them to find me. If they cornered me in the storage room, it would be over. My only chance was to catch them off guard. I stood slowly, leveling the gun at the hallway entrance. My hand trembled, and I forced myself to steady it. I took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the crates, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "Stop," I shouted, my voice cracking. Carl froze, the light catching his face. His eyes narrowed behind the mask, but he didn't raise his hands. Instead, he took a step forward, as if testing how serious I was. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I couldn't bring myself to pull it. Another sound caught my attention, a scuffle from behind me. I spun just as a second intruder, let's name him Hank, lunged from the shadows. His hand struck the flashlight, sending it tumbling to the floor, and we collided, the gun slipping from my grasp. We hit the ground hard, his weight pressing me against the cold floor. I struggled, managing to land a desperate elbow to his side. He grunted, momentarily loosening his grip, and I wriggled free, scrambling toward the fallen gun. My fingers closed around the grip just as he grabbed my ankle, yanking me back. I twisted, raising the gun and firing blindly. The deafening crack echoed through the cabin, and Hank released me, falling back with a cry of pain. The shot sent the others into a frenzy. I heard shouts from the main room, followed by hurried footsteps. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I bolted for the back door, throwing it open and plunging into the freezing night. The snow was deep, slowing my movements as I stumbled toward the tree line. My breath came in sharp gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. Behind me, the cabin glowed faintly, the flickering light from the stove casting eerie shadows. I didn't stop running until I reached a cluster of trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. I crouched behind one, my chest heaving, and listened. The night was silent again, the wind the only sound. I tightened my grip on the gun, my fingers numb. They would come for me, I was sure of it. But I wasn't going back to the cabin, not tonight. I glanced at the map in my pocket, the X mark deep in the woods. It wasn't safe here anymore. If I wanted answers, and any hope of surviving this, I'd have to follow the map to its end. The woods were silent except for the crunch of snow under my boots. The cold bit into my skin, sharper with every step, but I pushed forward. The map in my pocket felt heavier than it should. The promise of answers just as intimidating as the questions it had raised. The X marked in the dense forest was my only hope for survival, or at least understanding why I'd been targeted in this godforsaken place. The cabin was long behind me, its glow swallowed by the dark, endless trees. I clutched the handgun tightly in my gloved hands, the bag with the cash slung over my shoulder. I didn't know if they were following me yet, but I couldn't let myself stop. If I stayed still too long, the cold or whoever was hunting me would get me. After what felt like hours of trudging through the deep snow, I reached the spot marked on the map. The trees thinned, opening into a small clearing. At its center was a mound of snow, irregular and unnatural, as though someone had hastily tried to cover something. My breath fogged in front of me as I stood there, scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The woods felt alive, every creak of a branch or gust of wind a potential threat. I knelt by the mound, brushing away the snow with trembling hands. Beneath the surface, I uncovered a wooden hatch, reinforced with iron hinges. It was old, the wood splintered and weathered, but the metal locks were newer, secure, and deliberate. Someone didn't want this opened. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder. The trees stood motionless, but I could feel eyes watching me. With no time to second guess, I pulled the knife from my bag and wedged it into the gap between the lock and the wood. It took several attempts, the cold sapping my strength, but finally, the lock broke with a metallic snap. I lifted the hatch, revealing a narrow ladder leading into darkness. A faint smell of damp earth and something acrid wafted up, making me recoil. Whatever was down there, it wasn't good. But I couldn't turn back now. The ladder groaned under my weight as I descended into the dark. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing a small underground room carved into the frozen earth. The walls were reinforced with wooden beams, and the floor was packed dirt. At the center of the room stood a single table, cluttered with papers, maps, and old photographs. A faint hum came from a radio on the table, its signal weak and static-filled. As I approached, my heart sank. The photos were the same style as the ones I'd found in the cabin, but these showed more than just silhouettes at the tree line. They showed faces, men and women, all staring directly at the camera with cold, expressionless gazes. They weren't just observing the cabin, they were documenting everyone who had ever been stationed here. Pinned to the wall above the table was a large map of the region, marked with red circles and lines. The cabin was at the center of the web, but there were other locations, other cabins, each marked with an X. Notes scrolled in shorthand covered the margins, mentioning supply routes, schedules, and cryptic phrases like, secure all assets, and do not engage unless necessary. My stomach churned as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a remote ranger station, it was a hub, a key point in a network used for something far larger than I'd imagined: smuggling, trafficking, something darker. Whatever it was, my presence had disrupted it, and they weren't going to let me leave alive. The sound of boots on the ladder sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I spun around, raising the gun, my flashlight shaking in my hand. A figure descended into the room, their face obscured by a ski mask. It was Frank. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though he knew I had no way out. "You don't understand what you've stepped into," Frank said, his voice low and steady. "This isn't your fight. Stay back." I shouted, my voice cracking. "I don't care what this is, I just want to leave." He took another step, his gloved hands raised in a mock display of surrender. "You've seen too much. You should have left when we gave you the chance." Behind him, more footsteps echoed above. They weren't alone. Desperation surged through me. I couldn't let them corner me here. "I have the photos," I bluffed, my finger tightening on the trigger. "I've hidden them, and if anything happens to me, people will find out." He paused, his head tilting slightly, as though considering my words. The room grew silent except for the faint hum of the radio. Then he laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a chill down my spine. Do you think anyone cares? People disappear out here all the time. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. I fired a shot, the deafening sound reverberating in the small space. He ducked, the bullet striking the wall behind him, and I used the distraction to dart past him toward the ladder. Shouts erupted above as I climbed, my legs burning with effort. I emerged into the snow-covered clearing, gasping for air. The woods erupted into chaos. Flashlights cut through the trees as more figures closed in, their voices sharp and commanding. I sprinted into the forest, the gun heavy in my hand, the cash forgotten in the bag slung over my shoulder. Branches tore at my clothes as I ran, the snow slowing my movements. Behind me, the shouts grew louder, closer. I couldn't outrun them, not like this. My only chance was to outsmart them. I veered off the marked trail, plunging into deeper snow where the trees grew thicker. I doubled back several times, weaving through the underbrush to throw them off. My breath came in ragged gasps, every muscle in my body screaming for rest. Finally, I spotted a rocky outcrop jutting from the hillside. I scrambled toward it, slipping on the icy ground, and wedged myself into a narrow crevice. The darkness swallowed me, and I pressed myself against the cold stone, willing my breaths to quiet. The voices grew faint, then disappeared altogether. I stayed hidden, too afraid to move, for what felt like hours. When I finally emerged, the woods were silent again, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest outpost, miles away from the cabin. The ranger there looked at me like I was insane as I stumbled inside, my face pale and my hands shaking. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to get him to radio for help. The authorities arrived later that day. They listened to my story with skeptical expressions, but when they investigated the cabin, they found the evidence I'd left behind, the photos, the maps, the hidden stash. It was enough to launch an investigation, though I doubted it would lead anywhere. Whoever was behind this operation was too careful, too powerful to be taken down by one frightened ranger. I handed over everything I had, including the photos I'd kept hidden. As I walked away from the station, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I'd done what I could. It was over. Months later, I found myself back in civilization, far away from the snowy wilderness. The memories of that winter haunted me, but I tried to move on. One evening, as I sorted through my belongings, I came across a single photograph I didn't remember keeping. It showed the cabin, shrouded in darkness, with a faint silhouette standing at the edge of the tree line. My chest tightened as I stared at it, the old fear creeping back. I should have burned those photos the moment I found them. I'll never forget that sound. The crashing of feet on dry leaves, passing my tent. It was fast, like I had been visited by an Olympic sprinter 3 minutes to midnight. The first time it happened, I grabbed my gun and searched the surrounding area. Nothing, not a trace. Settling in my sleeping bag, it wasn't 5 minutes before something ran past the tent once more. 10 minutes later I heard it again, then nothing further as I waited for the sun to rise. The wilderness has always been my home away from home, my escape when life was alright. I've been on more camping trips than I can count, mostly alone. You see, I don't like people, so after many years abroad, another visit to the outdoors was way overdue. I had been scoping out a new camping site for a while. It was a few hours outside of town, but the reviews online were nothing short of glowing. This place prided itself on being for the solo traveler, with enough space for campers to pitch their tents without bothering each other. I was sold. With the essentials packed, including my Beretta 92 pistol for safety, I made my way down the highway and eventually arrived at the location's reception office. While some people are more adventurous, I prefer to explore areas curated for campers. Sure, it comes with an entrance fee, but at least I'm unlikely to stumble on the land of a lunatic with a shotgun. As I stepped into the reception, I was immediately struck by a feeling of emptiness. It wasn't because I was alone. This was a primal reaction that I felt in my gut. like the space around me was stealing my energy. As ridiculous as that sounds, it's the best description I've been able to come up with. Reaching the front desk, I called out for someone to assist me. It was almost 2 in the afternoon, and I knew that the camping site would be preceded by a short hike, as displayed on a nearby map. I didn't have to wait long before an old man in a blue cardigan arrived through the back office door. This guy was old, very old. At least 90. If I were to hazard a guess. He didn't act like it though. He spoke like a younger man and was far friendlier than his grim appearance would lead you to believe. Taking me through the rules and regulations of the land, he swiftly began saying something about the history of the area. Now, together. I'm not a rude person, but my adventure was calling, and I had barely been paying attention to what was being said. Perhaps too bluntly, I told the old man that I needed to be on my way. He was disappointed, sad in fact, but he didn't hesitate to guide me towards the start of the trail. Before I left, I was handed a pair of keys that would unlock a gate at the mouth of the forest. Finally, my holiday could begin. Despite the reception's map stating that the forest was 2 miles away, it took me many hours to reach the towering trees displayed on the website. At first, I wondered if my pace was too slow, but I knew I was as fit as I had ever been. I was surprised that the map was so wrong, but I didn't think much of it. By the time I reached the gate, the sun had begun to set. Standing before the metal barrier, I noticed that the fences on each stretched into an endless blur. I looked up at the massive tree line and peeked beyond the gate to see the wild world that I was eager to enter. I tried valiantly, but the key didn't work. Its shape didn't even match the lock. The many odd elements of this trip started to add up, but I shook it off as I was in dire need of a meal, and my thoughts would only slow me down. I suppose what I did next was illegal, but like I said, I had little energy for an alternative solution. Thankfully, the gate was quite short, so I tossed my bag and joined my belongings by climbing up and over. At this point, I wasn't picky about a camping location, so I searched for the first bit of flat open land. Passing the hulking trees, the day's last sunlight shone through the branches. I stopped and appreciated nature's beauty for a brief moment. To my despair, this pause brought on the same feeling I had at the reception office. My stamina was waning, so instead of finding an appropriate piece of ground, I immediately put up my tent and prepared an outdoor area for cooking. With a week's supply of beans ready to prepare, I decided to lie down and rest before starting the fire. I hadn't planned on sleeping just yet, but after closing my eyes for a second, I was out like a light. I'll never forget the sound that woke me up. Something ran past my tent. Initially, I wondered if it was an animal, but 4 feet colliding with the ground is more distinct than you might think. Whatever this was, it was on 2 legs. I searched the area quite thoroughly but found no sign of the unwelcome visitor. Back in my tent, I heard the noise 2 more times. On both occasions, I rushed out to catch my guest in the act. Again, nothing. I didn't get any more sleep that night. My mind was buzzing with theories. Maybe it was a bear on its hind legs. No, it ran too quickly. If it was human, why was it running in the woods? I have no idea. Thinking back now, what was more chilling than the crumbling leaves was the eerie silence when I was waiting for the sound to come back. The new day brought more questions as I quickly learned that my surroundings weren't what I expected. Exiting the tent, I noticed the ashes of a burnt-out fire. Had I started it before collapsing the night before? It didn't make sense, as I surely would have noticed the scorched wood when I searched the area at midnight. Although, I suppose the unwanted intruder had my attention at the time. I knew it was best for me to leave. I had planned to camp for 5 days, but one bizarre night was more than enough for me. The thought of the long hike back to the reception was daunting, but for the first time in my life, civilization was more appealing than the outdoors. As I packed my bags, I once again started to become drowsy. Was this due to my lack of sleep, or was it something else? I still don't know. Luckily, I have done training to operate on little rest, so packing my bags wasn't difficult. I was tired, but with my pistol strapped to my leg, I was ready to go. Tracking my movements from the day before, I followed the opening of the trees. I had sworn that I didn't travel into the woods, but after walking for an hour, I realized that I must have been wrong. I knew I had gone the right way. After all, I pride myself on my sense of direction. Once I reached 1 hour and 32 minutes, I shifted my focus from the ground to the trees. While much of the bark surrounding me was in a reddish-brown shade, there were a few unique prints in the color gray. That's when I realized I was walking in a loop. I timed it on my watch. Every 12 minutes and 16 seconds I passed a giant redwood with a gray marking in the shape of an eagle's head. Every 16 minutes and 11 seconds, I passed a tree that looked like it was decaying. This happened over and over, for what felt like hours. I tried everything, going in the opposite direction, moving horizontally, yet I remained stuck in the same cycle. My spirit was willing, but my body was weak, and after walking an endless path, I passed out amongst the dry leaves. Perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised at what woke me up, but I was startled nonetheless. The sound of the runner returned, but I didn't have the tent to protect me. The thin fabric wouldn't have done anything, but its absence still left me feeling bare. My instincts kicked in, and I reached for my gun. Rising to my feet, I pulled out my flashlight and applied the Harris technique, crossing my arms to prepare for combat in the dead of night. The noises continued as I searched for its origin. I noticed a quick shadow in the corner of my right eye and turned. Firing 2 bullets, there was nothing there. The sound came back, this time behind me. It took me only a second to spin my body and pull the trigger 3 times. Again, nothing. I repeated this pattern until all 15 rounds were spent. I remember wondering if I was going mad, but the thought was fleeting as my eyes and ears had never deceived me before. I don't mean to brag, but I'm good with a firearm. I can hit a target from a distance, even a moving one. In most situations, I am certain about my abilities, but not here. Every time I missed the target and splattered wood on the floor, I felt my confidence depleting. For the first time in my life, I felt that death could be near. I was scared. With my options depleted, I chose a direction and ran. My boots made a considerable impact on the ground, but I swear I heard a second set of feet not too far behind me, keeping up with my pace. Maybe it was an act of God, maybe it was luck. Whatever it was, I soon arrived at the locked gate that swallowed me into the forest. At the time, I barely questioned why it was opened. I simply pushed through and continued towards the reception office and entered its walls after 46 minutes. My memory here gets a bit hazy, but I do remember that the building had its lights off. However, this was no concern for me, as after slamming through the front door, I jumped in my car and drove home. I wish I could end this story with a shocking plot twist or powerful life lesson, but this camping trip is as mysterious today as it was the day I exited the forest. If I didn't know any better, I would say that I briefly entered another dimension, but if I tell anyone that I fear that they will have me locked up at the funny farm. If I'm being completely honest, this trip left me feeling alive, more than I have been in a long time. I'm writing this with my bag packed in front of me. Even though the website for the camping site has been taken down, I vividly remember the directions to its reception. I don't know what's going to happen, but I am sure of one thing in particular. This time, I will pay close attention to what the old man has to say. I had always enjoyed the beauty and tranquility of nature, where the rustling leaves and gentle breeze provided a comfortable embrace. The city, with its continual noise and demands, drained my vitality and clouded my thinking. Even in the quietest moments, the hum of traffic, sirens blasting, and the constant rush of people still echoed in my mind. I craved the simplicity and quiet that only the wilderness could offer. So one Friday afternoon, unable to bear the oppressive environment any longer, I made the sudden choice to escape. After gathering my supplies, I loaded my backpack with everything I would need: a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, a knife, a flashlight, and my reliable old compass. As I drove away from the city, the landscape gradually transformed. Towering skyscrapers gave way to sprawling suburbs, which then dissolved into vast open fields. I soon arrived at the forest's edge, which felt like a completely different universe because of how far away it was from civilization. The treetops were bathed in a golden hue as the sun began to set, enveloping the surrounding area in a cozy, inviting glow. I pulled over, let out a long breath, and got out of my car. I picked up my backpack and headed down the narrow path that led into the woods. As I ventured deeper, an uncomfortable sense of regret and dread began to wash over me, the sensation only intensifying the further I went. I couldn't explain why I felt this way, but it felt like my decision to leave the city was a major mistake. For whatever reason, my instincts shouted at me to turn back, but I dismissed the feeling, rationalizing that it was simply the result of being alone in such a remote, secluded location. As dusk fell, I pitched my tent in a clearing, lit a small bonfire, and prepared a simple meal, its aroma blending with the cool evening air. As I sat down to eat, night fell and the forest became strangely quiet, with the regular sounds of nocturnal wildlife going silent. Then, an abrupt and distant rustle interrupted the stillness, a sound that cut through the thick silence. I froze, every muscle tensed, straining to hear. The sound was subtle, nearly identical to the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But it carried a weight, a malevolence that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if unseen eyes were monitoring my every move, their gaze heavy with ill intent. I scanned the forest, the light from the bonfire barely piercing the darkness. But I saw nothing. Yet the feeling persisted. I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, a consequence of being alone in the wilderness. I sighed and withdrew into my tent as the bonfire dwindled to embers, zipping it up tight. The thin layer of nylon provided little relief against my unease. Exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. I awoke unexpectedly in the dead of night. The silence was deafening and pressed down on me like a tangible weight. My heart raced in my chest, and a cold sweat stuck to my skin. I couldn't explain why I felt such overwhelming fear, but it was as if every instinct in my body warned me that I was in danger. I lay there frozen in panic, my senses on high alert, listening closely. I initially heard nothing, but then there was a soft, almost undetectable rustle outside the tent. I thought it may have been an animal looking for food, but deep down I knew it was something much more sinister. I slowly reached for the flashlight beside me and closed my fingers around it. I summoned all of my courage and opened the tent just enough to see outside. The darkness was impenetrable, and the moonlight was blocked by thick clouds. I flicked on my flashlight, and its brightness barely pierced through the darkness. I saw nothing at first, just the familiar silhouettes of trees and underbrush, but the feeling of being watched was now stronger than ever. Then I noticed its eyes reflecting the light from the bushes, low to the ground, unblinking. Panic overwhelmed me, and I tried to zip back up the tent, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. My thoughts raced, thinking of all the possible dangers: a bear, a wolf, or perhaps a mountain lion. No. Deep down, I realized this wasn't an animal, it was something far worse. The realization sent shivers down my spine. Then I heard it again. A rustling sound outside that disturbed the silence, faint yet distinct. The rustling became louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Then I heard another noise, a gentle scratching, like claws across fabric. My breath became trapped in my throat. The sound was now coming from directly outside the tent. I aimed my flashlight towards the noise, illuminating the nylon wall. There, silhouetted against the fabric, was a hand. But this was no ordinary hand. It was unnaturally large, with elongated fingers that ended in sharp, blackened nails. My blood ran cold. I had heard tales of creatures in the woods, myths and legends, but I had never believed in them. Yet here I was, face to face with something from a nightmare. The hand slid slowly and curiously along the tent wall. I tried to keep silent, but the beating of my heart was loud enough to wake the dead. Then the hand vanished. I waited, barely daring to breathe. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick. Just when I thought I might have just imagined it, there was a sudden, violent tug at the tent's zipper. The teeth of the zipper gradually began to separate, and I realized I needed to act. I took out my hunting knife and prepared to protect myself against whatever evil was out there. As the zipper slid lower, I caught a glimpse of pale, ashen skin. My flashlight began to flicker, casting erratic shadows. With a final, aggressive yank, the zipper was now fully open. There, at the entrance of my tent, was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall and gaunt, with skin that appeared to have never seen the sun. It was bald, with enormous black eyes that reflected my flashlight's beam with an awful, soulless gleam. Its mouth was a gaping maw, lined with sharp, needle-like teeth. The creature's limbs were grotesquely elongated, ending in those same blackened claws that had touched the tent. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it crawled forward with strange fluidity. It tilted its head as if inspecting me and let out a low, guttural hiss. Suddenly, my survival instincts kicked in. I lunged with the knife, aiming for the creature's heart, or where I thought it would be. The blade made contact, sinking into its flesh. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech, recoiling in pain. Seizing the moment, I burst from the tent and sprinted into the forest, driven by sheer adrenaline. I fled blindly through the woods, branches ripping at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear the creature chasing me. Its motions were quick and predatory. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear its enraged screeches echoing in my ears. I stumbled and fell, the flashlight flying from my hand and smashing against a rock. Darkness enveloped me. Desperation gave me the strength to push myself up and continue my frenzied escape, with the sounds of pursuit growing louder and closer. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare to stop. As I ran, hours appeared to pass, and the forest became a blur. Just when I felt I couldn't run any further, I came upon a narrow road and collapsed onto it, exhausted. As daylight broke, a passing car discovered me, a disheveled mix of panic and relief. I attempted to explain what had happened to the man in the car, but the words failed me. After doing extensive research, I am positive that what I encountered that night was a pale crawler. The forest that had once been my refuge had transformed into a realm of nightmares. I've never been back to those woods since, plagued by the memory of those lifeless eyes, and the fear that, somewhere out there in the deep, dark depths of the forest, the pale crawler still lurks, watching, waiting for its next victim. I hope that my story can bring some entertainment to you, and some therapy for me. I still have trouble trusting myself. I still don't fully believe what I saw, but I know what I felt. When I told my friend, he blamed it on me being delirious from fear, and that it could have been a bear or mountain lion. I guess I didn't know what I saw, but it was nothing anybody could actually believe unless they experienced it themselves. I grew up in Western Canada, just outside Vancouver, a little under a couple hours' drive to the Washington border. One thing about people from British Columbia is almost everyone goes hiking. The crime in BC isn't anything to raise concerns about. You only need to be more worried about bears, wolves, and mountain lions. It was the beginning of summer, June of 2020. Everyone was isolated and I was working from home. After being isolated for what felt like forever, I needed to get outside. While doing some research on hiking trails I hadn't yet been to, I discovered a trail called Golden Ears, which is still to this day one of the most difficult hiking trails due to its lack of maintenance. I was a very experienced hiker, even at 20, but none of my friends could come because they were all sick with COVID. I knew I should have waited till they felt better, but I couldn't stay inside a second longer. I should have just chosen an easier hike, but I didn't. I packed up my bag with my usual gear with the addition of bear mace because of the season and 2 flashlights. 1 battery operated and 1 hand cranked. I always carried a backup flashlight and I'm grateful to this day for it. I made the hour's drive and saw from the road markers I was at the center point of the Washington border in my hometown. When I started the trail it was about 12 p.m. I usually leave my phone in my car because you never get a signal out there anyway. Too many trees and mountains. I do carry an emergency radio if I really need to call for help. The trail I was on was an estimated 6-hour hike, which wouldn't be an issue as it made a full circle, and I would get home no later than 8 p.m. before it would get dark. I parked on the southeast end of the trail and started my way, following the yellow markings of my trail, and found some beautiful high cliffs with just the most gorgeous views. The weather was very forgiving that day, just beautiful, with no rain like we are used to out west. The way the lakes would look like beautiful twinkling gems, and breathtaking scenery of the mountains and local fauna. As I moved deeper into the trail, I started noticing some of the markings were fading and becoming harder to spot. This wasn't an unusual thing in hiking trails so deep in the mountains, but it did raise some concern. It felt like I was getting lost, but I kept persevering, checking my map and my compass to direct me instead of the markings. I would mark the lake I passed by so I would remember where I came from and where I needed to go. I think I got so worked up checking my map that I could no longer see any markings or paths. I thought this was a good time for a break. I got out some snacks and tried to relax myself. Keeping yourself together is crucial when you're lost. It is life or death, and any decision I made going forward had to be from a sane mind. As I packed up, I heard the faintest noise through the trees, like a steam train that was far in the distance, but I blamed it on the wind and some hollow branches. My watch read 5 p.m., and I couldn't imagine that I had already spent 5 hours on the trail. I would have seen something by then, even with relentlessly checking my map. It literally felt as if someone had picked up and dropped me at a random point. I couldn't recognize anything around me. When I checked my map and compass, I looked for anything that could be on the map. I needed to find higher ground. I saw a nearby incline and decided sometimes you have to get deeper in to really get out. When I reached the incline, I saw in the distance what looked like a worn-out crossroads sign. There was nothing on the map that indicated there was a railroad of any kind, so I assumed it must have been some joke or mistake that nobody bothered to fix. When I decided that I really needed to turn back, I somehow lost my balance on what was sturdy ground and fell down the hill and rolled nearby to the tracks. The fall had broken my watch and it stopped at 5:13 p.m., and it was now golden hour, meaning I had less than a few hours before the sun would set. I hadn't thought to pack my climbing gear because I read there were no cliffs or rocks to climb in the trail. I still feel how panicked and stunned I was at how much everything was going wrong. But they don't teach you what to do when things go right. They teach you when things don't go according to plan. Curiosity might have killed the cat, but I still approached the tracks because it was almost like I was supposed to see them. They looked worn out, and they seemed to stretch on a while. Nearby was a small river that was flowing down north, so I decided to follow upstream until I found an incline where I could manage to climb it, where the tracks seemed to grow. Walking along the tracks, it made it easier on my feet because of the flat surface. The sun was so far hidden behind the myriad of large trees and the abundance of mountains. It could have been still bright out, but I couldn't tell. I felt consumed in the forest. I was slightly hysterical, isolated, alone, and barely armed. I was easy prey if anything caught me off guard. That's when things got even more strange. When I pulled out my flashlight and radio, my radio would only sound static or play old, timey-style songs, like ones you would hear in a silent film. It was an old emergency radio my dad had given me, and it can tune into different stations. But it wasn't a time to play music and draw attention to myself. When I turned on my flashlight, it flickered and would barely stay on, I assumed, because I might have forgotten to change the batteries. I tried relentlessly to get the radio to call or relay my message, but it wouldn't stop playing that same stupid tune whenever I turned it on. I kept my radio off in hopes that when I reached higher ground the signal would improve. I switched to my hand, cranked flashlight, but it wasn't exactly a quiet fix. It just drew attention to my location. I made haste in fear of attracting any sort of predator. I was extremely out of my element and comfort zone. I could feel all sorts of eyes watching me as I made my way up the tracks and against the stream. The sound of the water trickling was the only comfort I had. After about a kilometer of walking, I heard a branch snap behind me. I instantly turned around because I was walking on a railroad, not the ground. When I turned on my cranked flashlight, I saw two larger-than-life eyes blink at me, at the faintest figure of what I thought was a person, so I yelled out to them, and it ran off. Possibly a deer, one might think, but deer aren't usually ones to stay for long after a noise is heard. They're one of the first to run. I continued up, convincing myself it was a deer, but something didn't feel right about the size of the eyes. I could see how big they glowed, and I was barely 30 feet away. I could start to see the end of the tracks, so I was making progress. But I could hear low grumbling and the sound of leaves crunching in pairs, like someone was putting one foot forward and then the next, and it started to grow closer. I cranked my flashlight some more to see anything around me. I shook my beer mace and had it ready with the cap off. Together, I continued forward, and the stream had ended, my only comfort gone, and only tracks remained in the encompassing darkness of the whispering trees. I could finally see the end of the tracks was near, but it was pitch black, and I couldn't make out anything. I started to lose hope so much that I was desperate to even find somewhere to hide. I wouldn't starve, but I didn't want to be something's next meal. Paranoid from the sounds, I checked behind me with my flashlight almost every other second. As I was about 60 feet from the end, I heard a thud and crunching behind me. Call it a prey's intuition, but I could feel something after me. I could hear the wind change as it ran, and the ground thud as it moved. I didn't even think to use my flashlight this time, turning around, and I instantly used my mace. It definitely stunned whatever thing was behind me, but nothing could mimic the powerful screech it made as it ran off. My ears rang the rest of the night. I could see the faintest silhouette, and there was nothing I could explain and sound sane of mind. I remember running so hard my lungs weren't even being used. I was just pure muscle and fear moving. The most scary thing about that night wasn't even the thing that stalked me. Once I reached the end of the tracks, I was back in the southeast parking lot where my car sat untouched. I threw my shit in the back and started the car and left, not turning back. The next morning I went back with my friend to show him, and there wasn't a single trace of tracks, just the bare mace I dropped outside my car. There have been reported drownings at that place that are unexplained, and I feel like it's those who follow the tracks down and instead of up. Who knows? Maybe I really imagined it being there so long and afraid. I just never want to feel like prey ever again. I feel a lot better telling my story now, even if it's to a completely random source. Thank you to whoever reads this and sympathizes with me. Wow, I can't believe this works. Hi everyone, this is my blog for my upcoming hiking trip. I am so excited to share where I am hiking, The Nahani National Park. I'm so excited to be given the opportunity to hike here and share it with all of you. Well, gotta get back to packing. Lel. Keep following this blog and you will get updates very, very soon. See ya then. My supplies: food, sleeping bag, bear spray tent, and toothbrush and toothpaste, a deodorant, shotgun bullets, fishing gear, beer, traps, protection, EDT. I totally forgot, but so many people asked what park this is because they have never heard of it before. The nickname for this park is actually the Valley of Headless Corpses, and I looked up why this canyon has been given that name. The reason for the name is that so many people keep being found without their heads. Lowell. Oh, and by the way, an Indian tribe actually disappeared here, which gives into the spooky feeling of the canyon. So I will not be sleeping at all, joking of course, but still, kinda spooky. Anyway. By then. Monday, April 6, 2024, I can't believe I made it. Everything looks spectacular, and the canyon walls look absolutely gorgeous. I wish I could take pictures, but sadly I can't. The one bad part was that I had to go in a helicopter, and had to be airlifted into the canyon. Because there was no way to get my car down here, I'm actually scared of heights. Would rather be on the ground, lol. But now I'm here. My eyes can't take in this awesome beauty. I'm one of the few people that can actually be down here, so it's just me and nature, the way that I like it. The helicopter pilot told me that there were a set of rules for me to follow, nicknamed THEMT. Talk with the official on the phone if you see anything suspicious. Hover around the area, and be absolutely sure that you saw something. Do this before calling an authority figure. Evaluate the situation. Know if you are in immediate danger, or if you can get out of the situation. Move away from the immediate danger. Do teach isa tall soestes. If you cannot move at the sight of danger, follow evaluate the situation. Try to find a clear escape plan, and then call an authority figure. To be honest with you, I'm not too worried. They keep saying to remember this stuff, but like, how bad can it be? The worst thing that can happen is a bear gets into my food, or is too close to my tent. But I have a gun and bear spray, I'm fine. I hiked for a little bit, but as the sun started coming down, I decided to set my tent up by some bushes. I ate a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that I prepared, and started writing this. I'm about to hit the hay soon, so good night everyone. Stay tuned for more awesome adventures. Tuesday, April 7th, 2024. Hello again, everyone. It's me again, and I just want to say I'm so happy that people are invested in my hiking trip. It warms my heart, and I care deeply about each and every one of you. I just want to clear a couple things up before I talk about my day. Some people are worried that I'm here, that I will get killed. And to that I say I'm fine. I really don't understand what the big problem is. A couple of hunters got killed in mysterious ways 100 years ago. What does that have to do with me? I care deeply for your concerns, but trust me, I am, and will be, 100% okay. Anyway, enough of that, let me talk to you about my day. The sun came up early, so I set up my beer traps. I want to stay in this location for a couple of days, and decided I wanted an organic breakfast. So I went and got some berries. They were very delicious. I went around and explored the area and found a river. I will go fishing there before I leave. I saw so many fish in the water. This is such a beautiful place, it's practically untouched. I saw rabbits, butterflies, birds, frogs, and other funny little critters that God gave us. I wish Bob Ross was here. I bet he could paint the most beautiful picture of this canyon. For lunch and dinner, I decided to make some stew. I guess the smell of the stew attracted some bears, because I kept seeing them, far off in the distance. Anyways, I hope each and every one of you have a good rest of your day. Bye. Wednesday, April 8, 2024. Hello to all the people who are keeping up with this blog. I just want to still say how thankful I am that each and every one of you cares so much about stupid ol' me. It means the world. I must admit, I totally forgot to write about today. You may ask yourself why, and to that I answer with beers. I have been seeing them all day. I decided to move from my current position. The stew smell kept them around, and so I decided to hike to a new place. But it seems that I just can't shake them off. They are determined to get to me. Lel. I hike for 30 minutes, take a break, and from the corner of my eye, I can see a massive bear hiding from me. Then I look around and notice not one bear, but maybe 3 or 4 are surrounding me, hiding. It honestly freaks me out a little bit, but I'm still 100% safe. I found a new place to set up my tent. It is right by a boulder, and used almost all of my beer spray. Don't want to be mauled to death, lol. I decided to have a couple peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch and dinner. I don't want to make something that will attract bears again. Anyways, that's all that happened today. See ya tomorrow. Thursday, April 9th, 2024. I think the bears found me again. It's still really weird how none of my bear traps have gone off, but there's 3-4 bears that I saw while hiking yesterday. I dunno, I might be going crazy, might be one of the canyon's tricks. But I think one of them, the big yip's following me. I went fishing today, and actually caught a ton of fish. All was well until I heard a massive roar. It sounded like the bear was right next to me, prepared to rip me to pieces right then and there. But there was no bear at all. I just brushed it off as my mind was playing tricks on me, like it has the past 2 days. I kept hearing the roars get quieter and quieter. I totally forgot about the roars. That was until I heard something massive run in the brush right next to me. It had to be that bear, so I ran back to my tent, grabbed my shotgun, and was determined to kill it. I looked into the bush, but I saw no bear. I did, however, see footprints. Bear footprints. I tracked the footprints, and it seemed like the bear was walking right next to the river, and then just stopped. I literally mean the tracks ended. There weren't any tracks that led on. Again, kinda strange. Hopefully I scared it off, and honestly, I'm kind of scared right now. Why does this bear want to kill me so badly? Please pray for my safety, everyone. See you then. Friday, April 10th, 2024. That wasn't a bear. I don't know what the hell it is. And I heard it right by my tent last night. I woke up because I needed to pee really badly. As I moved over to open my tent, I noticed something very strange. There was a shadow of a bear right next to my tent. I heard very labored breathing, and smelt something putrid. The bear was trying to quietly enter my tent but couldn't. He couldn't seem to get the zipper to work. I guess he got frustrated, because he walked off. I tried to open my tent and see if it was the massive bear that's been following me, but the bear was gone before I could peek my head out. To say I was scared would be an understatement. I couldn't sleep at all. I was waiting for the bear to come back. But he didn't come back. When the sun started to rise, I decided to get up and look around my place, to see if the bear got into anything. Nothing got moved. None of my food was eaten. But I saw bear tracks again. That was no surprise, but what was a surprise was the tracks were in a set of 2, not 4. Normally, a bear would walk on all 4s, only walking on 2 to threaten a rival bear, or to get food that was on a tree. But the set of tracks that I was looking at had 2. Another weird thing was that it seemed like the bear didn't change to going on all 4. It stayed on 2. What? That makes no sense. A bear tried to get in my tent, but couldn't. So it instead walked away like a human. That honestly freaks me out the more I think about it. Maybe it wasn't a bear, maybe it was something else, I don't know. I'm really tired, my eyes keep darting around, waiting for the thing to come back. Hopefully it doesn't, but you gotta prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Saturday, April 11, 2024. Holy shit, I think I might die here. Weird things have been going on. I don't know if I'm tired or just paranoid from yesterday, but I keep noticing small things that freak me out. At the beginning I mentioned how much wildlife was here. I have seen nothing today. No birds are chirping, haven't seen rabbits, frogs, and even bugs. I feel like I'm trapped, and I'm the only one making noise in the forest. I also feel like I'm being watched. by something that I don't know what it is. I also keep hearing beers roaring in the distance, but they don't sound 100% like a beer, but something trying to imitate them. Am I in the forest with a skinwalker? I keep trying to tell myself that I'm not, to help myself from going insane. I am determined to get out of here, Ali, Jesus Christ. I know for a fact now that it isn't a beer now. I was typing on this laptop when I heard something strange. I decided to check it out. I followed the sound until I came across a clearing. I looked around until I saw a person. It's nighttime, so I wasn't completely sure I saw a human due to low visibility, so I hid by some trees to be safe. The human was holding something. A can. He was holding onto a jerry can. He stopped in the middle of the clearing, looked around, and then started pouring a liquid from the jerry can on himself. He then lit a match, threw it on the ground, and immediately was engulfed in flames. I could tell that he was trying to yell something, but the flames kept cutting out his words. He stood there, trying to scream words. But then he noticed me. I ran. I ran as fast as I could. I looked behind me and noticed that this person was incredibly fast and was catching up. I knew I wasn't going to outrun him, so I decided to hide in some brush. A light started to come into view, and I heard the sound of flames. I knew he was here. He stopped, tried to scream something again, but couldn't. He was gasping for air, and I saw the skin melting off, exposing raw muscle, tendons, and bone. His eyes kept darting wildly, knowing I was here, but couldn't pinpoint on where I was hiding. He was trying to find me, and I was trying to keep myself hidden as best as I could. Then I thought of a plan. Every time he turned away from the bush that I was hiding in, I would push myself back, being very quiet, and eventually get away. And so I did. He would turn his back. I would crawl away. Then when he turned to my bush, I would lay flat, hoping that the shadows covered me. I did this a couple of times until I could not see him anymore. I stayed there hiding behind a tree until I noticed the light bouncing off trees was going farther and farther away. I was safe. Frankly, I don't know what the hell that thing was. I know it was a human, but how come he was able to survive while being engulfed in flames? All I know is that I'm done. My trip ends tomorrow. The helicopter is coming to pick me up tomorrow, and I am going to the canyon wall before it does. I'm sick and tired of this forest. If I go by the wall, I can see if something is following me. There is nothing it can hide behind. It's too rocky for plants to grow. Hopefully I make it out of here alive. Sunday, April 12, 2024. I made to the canyon wall. I'm out of the forest all morning. While I was packing up my tent and things, I felt like I was being watched. I felt like whatever was out there, looking at me, wanted me dead. I am so thankful to be out of the forest. I actually was able to find a small cave in the wall that I was able to climb into. I'm staying here until I hear the helicopter. I am thankful to make a once-in-a-lifetime trip out here, but I am also thankful that it is over. I hear it, the helicopter. It might be a different helicopter, because it sounds a little off. Maybe they needed to repair the other helicopter, who knows. Anyways, all I know is I'm finally getting out of here. Before I go, I want to thank each and every one of you who have been so involved in my trip. It means the world that so many of you care about me, and it touches me deeply. It all started a few years ago. It was your run-of-the-mill boring shift at the office. I worked the night shifts, and our staff was pretty small, so there was usually only 1 or 2 other rangers working with me. But on this specific night I was alone. I yawned and looked at the clock. It read 3:00 a.m. Only a few hours to go. Suddenly, I heard a branch crack outside. Like the paranoid person I was, I instantly tensed up and began to slightly panic. You're being crazy. It's just an animal or something. My paranoia returned twofold once I heard another branch breaking. I knew it was most likely nothing, but I got up and made sure the door was locked. And then I looked out the window. scanning the area for anything suspicious. I took a deep sigh of relief when the answer was affirmative. Upon sitting down, I swore I could hear the faintest footsteps coming from outside the office. So faint that they could have been in the back of my mind, but then they grew louder, and there was no doubt that they were real. The footsteps seemed to be getting louder and closer by the second, and they sounded like no normal animals or humans. I tried to distract myself by playing some games on my computer, but the paranoia was becoming too much to ignore. I jumped when I heard the horrific sound of screeching nails on one of the back office windows. I got up and quickly made my way to the window, only to find a long, red scratch mark. My stomach threatened to empty itself at the sight. Usually I like being alone at the night shift, but at this moment I wished I had another co-worker with me. I heard another scratching noise, this time coming from the window closest to my desk. I ran out of the room and watched as 5 terrifying nails slowly scratched their way down the window, leaving the same red mark. I spent the next half hour sitting in my chair shaking and teeming with intense anxiety, hearing the scratching sound every so often. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and looked at the first window. It was totally and utterly covered with red scratch marks. There was absolutely no seeing out of that window. I checked every other window, and it was the same for all of them. I sat back down and looked at the clock. It was now 4:00 a.m., meaning there was only around an hour until dawn. If I can just wait for the morning shift to arrive, I should be okay. I knew I needed to make myself as comfortable as possible in such a situation. I went to each window and closed the curtains. I then settled down in my chair and tried to distract myself with some random news articles, really the only entertainment I could access on the work computers. I shot up in my seat when I heard a horrific scream coming not too far from the office. I got out of my seat and made sure I had my firearm handy. I walked over to the front and tried to look out the window, examining the surrounding areas. The scream had sounded like someone was in trouble or deeply fearful. I opened the door and embraced the chilly air before venturing into the outside world. I locked the door behind me and clicked on my flashlight and slowly scanned the surrounding area, finding nothing. "Is anyone out here?" I called out. I was met with the same horrific scream as my response, this time sounding much closer. The scream caused me to jump, and my nerves were filled with paranoia. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out shakily. "Help!" I heard an uncanny voice shriek, sending me into a panicked daze. I continued to scan the area with my flashlight, desperately hoping to see what was making these terrifying screams. The hairs on my neck stood up when I felt the gut-wrenching sensation of being breathed upon. I turned around and aimed my flashlight directly behind me, illuminating the cruel imitation of a woman staring right at me. After the initial shock subsided, I booked it back to the ranger's office. I pulled out my set of keys and tried to find the one that would unlock the door, but it wasn't there. I turned around and was met with the scene of the skinwalker tauntingly dangling the key I needed in front of me. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I ran to the side of the office and began to relentlessly pound on the glass window, but it just wouldn't break. I looked behind me once more and saw the skinwalker was now a dozen paces closer. Together, I involuntarily screamed from pure fear and booked it into the forest, not caring where I was going, only caring about putting as much distance between me and this horrific creature as possible. While running, I pulled out my cell phone and crashed when I saw it had no service. I then pulled out my radio and tried to call for backup, but my only response was static. After running for a while, my body gave out from exhaustion. As I lay on the forest ground, pushing as many deep lungfuls of oxygen I could into my lungs, I scanned the area, looking for any sign of the skinwalker. Once I locked eyes with the 2 eyes staring at me from behind a tree, adrenaline took over, and I was suddenly able to run again. I knew just how long the forest stretched. It would take me a long time to reach the end, and even when I did, it wasn't like anyone would be there waiting to help me. "Please help me," the creature shrieked. Something about its voice was incredibly distressing and inhuman. I picked up my pace twofold, not caring about how scratched up I would be from all the branches and whatnot. I was running into at full speed. I tripped over a branch and screamed in pain as my face impacted the ground. I scurried onto my feet and noticed my flashlight was no longer on. I couldn't see anything. I could only hear the sound of the footsteps getting closer and closer. I felt the flashlight and realized that one of the batteries had fallen out during my fall. I bent down and panickedly felt the ground near me, desperately hoping to come across the battery I needed for my most important sense: sight. I decided to cut my losses and leave the flashlight when the footsteps had become too close to ignore. I was now briskly walking through the forest instead of running, my arms out in front of me to feel what was ahead of me. After a long time of venturing in the forest, I had finally made it out. I looked at the dimly moonlit river beneath me, feeling the tiniest bit safer. The tiny sense of safety I felt was ripped away from me once I heard the footsteps. I climbed down and began to run on the river's beach. My body kept threatening to collapse from exhaustion, but I wouldn't let it. I looked behind me while I ran, and could now see the skinwalker in greater detail. It had morphed from the uncanny woman into a four-legged beast, charging at me on all fours. I searched through my mind, trying to gather up all of the information I knew about skinwalkers. I had heard of the legends of a skinwalker roaming this park, but I always thought it was just a nonsense fairy tale. I remembered that a way to kill a skinwalker was to state its true identity to it. I now had an idea, but it fell very short. I had no clue what this creature's true identity was, and it was pretty clear I had no way of finding it in the near future. I looked up and felt a small glimpse of hope when I saw the light of the sun slowly creeping up above the mountains. I looked behind me and suddenly noticed that I couldn't see the creature following me anymore. I took a sigh of relief and slowed down my pace slightly, but I didn't dare stop running. I knew that the closest ranger's office was only an hour's walk away. I ran for a while longer, and then slowed to a brisk walk due to the exhaustion I had put my body through. After a long and treacherous walk, I could see the other ranger's office in my sight, and the sun had now fully risen. I made it to the ranger's office and attempted to catch my breath while banging on the door. I heard footsteps shuffle and come my way, and then the door opened, revealing another park ranger looking concerned. "Geez, are you all right?" he asked. "There's something in the woods," I said between ragged breaths. "I know." The ranger calmly responded. "W, what?" I asked shackily. I said. The ranger started. I watched in complete horror as the ranger slowly morphed into the creature I was familiar with. Before he fully morphed, I took one last look at his badge. His name read, Apache-Sioux. "I know," the creature finished, its voice now heavily distorted. I instantly bolted to the river behind me, and the creature followed. I didn't know if I could run much longer without passing out. Suddenly, I realized that the name on his badge would be a good guess to his true identity. I decided to take the risk. I stopped in my tracks and turned around. Apache-Sioux. The creature suddenly seemed startled, and it began to retreat. Apache, Sioux. I screamed, even causing the creature to run away. I began to roar out in maniacal laughter. I had won. Or so I thought. Out of nowhere, I heard the deafening sound of what sounded like dozens of thousands of gut-wrenching screams at once. I felt my ears as they throbbed in pain. I heard the sound of trees rustling, and I turned to see the most panic-inducing scene of hundreds of skinwalkers and wendigos running out of all directions of the forest, charging at me. I screamed and ran into the ranger's office, closing and locking the door behind me. I sat down in the chair and began to hyperventilate, When the creatures started relentlessly banging on all sides of the office, it seemed like no end was near except the end of my life. Shit, shit, shit. I screamed in a frustrated and fearful tone. The skinwalkers and wendigos began to tear down pieces of the building one by one, causing me to slowly retreat into the center of the room, until the building was almost entirely destroyed. The next few minutes were a horror-filled daze. The creatures were slowly removing the last pieces of building, as if to taunt me. I swear I even heard a few of them snicker. I didn't know much about these legendary creatures, so I figured it would be a good idea to commit the most destructive act I could think of: a fire. As a park ranger, I had some decent experience of knowing how to make a fire with nothing except a rock and steel. I began to search through what was left of the office, and a pocket knife, oh so tantalizing, caught my eye. I ran for the pocket knife, but the creatures must have known what I was attempting, so they jumped off and attacked me. It was pure agony, and I literally felt like I had been transported to hell. Each of the creatures mercilessly tortured me, but my brain blocked out the pain the best it could and focused on the one thing that mattered in that moment: creating a fire. I grabbed the pocket knife, flipped it open, and rubbed a rock against it. I saw sparks forming, and my eyes widened with hope. I tried and tried again, until eventually one of the sparks caught the wood and fire began to slowly but surely envelope the building. The creatures all shrieked and slowly retreated from the growing flame, and so did I. Some of the creatures had already been caught in the fire, and were too far gone already. Only a handful survived, and they all decided to run into the forest. I pressed my radio and explained that a fire had erupted and that it was spreading fast. I ran down to the river, thinking it would give the best chance of protection from this fire. I jumped into the river and struggled immensely as the current tried to pull me into its wrath. But I swam and swam until I was on the other side. I collapsed on the ground and took in deep lungfuls of oxygen, feeling victorious but also defeated at the same time. I looked back and saw that my radio was floating down the heavy current. I cursed at myself and got up. I decided to cut my losses and move on. I needed to find the nearest ranger office to alert them of the fire before it got too bad. I walked into the forest and was instantly enveloped with paranoia. I felt like I was being watched with a million taunting eyes, waiting for me with pure rage after what I had just done. I stopped in my tracks and looked around, examining every single piece of every tree, trying to ease my paranoia. Just as I was about to let my guard down, I saw two unblinking and menacing eyes staring directly at me from behind a tree. At first, I froze in complete fear and shock, but just as soon after I was running for my life once again, giving me a strong sense of unpleasant déjà vu. I didn't know much about this part of the park, but I assumed this forest didn't go on for that long. After hours of walking, I had proven my assumption incorrect. This forest seemed to be going on forever, and I could smell the nasty smell of smoke growing more pungent. Finally, I noticed the trees becoming less close to each other, and before I knew it, I was out of the forest. I made it to the office and explained the fire situation to the officers there, but not bothering to explain the skinwalker situation to them. I knew they would just think it was insane nonsense. Anyways, I eventually made it home safely, but I quit my job very shortly after that. And I still have nightmares about those creatures to this day.